Chapter 297. The Bayou brothel was still open for business. Although there were a few well-informed people who knew that the Fan family and the second prince had been fighting over the most popular brothel in the capital, the Fan family had only beaten the Bayou brothel a little and did not have much of a reaction. The Overwatch Council did not make things difficult for the Bayou brothel either, so everyone thought the matter was over. In the minds of these officials, this was a very natural outcome. After all, no matter how arrogant Fanxian was, there was always a lot of taboo in front of a prince. Furthermore, in the eyes of the public, the second master of the Fan family was running the Bayou brothel. Although it had damaged the reputation of the Fan family, he had earned a lot of money from it. If everyone worked together to suppress this matter, it would be a win-win situation. To the people of the capital who did not know what was going on, they only saw the Overwatch Council raiding the brothel and heard the beating of the wooden planks in Fan Manor. To them, there was something strange about the whole thing. When did the Emperor's Secret Service begin to manage the brothel? What had happened to the Fan family? Why had the little tyrants of the streets of the capital suddenly disappeared without a trace? But regardless of whether they knew about this matter or not, they all thought that this matter would be the same as the usual conflicts between influential officials in the capital. In the end, because of the invisible but dense network of relationships in the air, it would disappear without a trace. As the saying goes, good for you, good for me, and good for everyone. However, the managers, girls, and shopkeepers of the Bayou brothel were not as relaxed as outsiders thought. This was because ever since the Overwatch Council raided the brothel, the big boss had not returned to the Bayou brothel. It was as if he had disappeared. Although there were rumors that the young big boss was under house arrest, no one could rest easy without confirmation. Plus, the second boss had a special status, so he could not watch over the brothel every day. For a while, the Bayou brothel maintained a calm appearance, but there was an undercurrent that was slowly flowing under the surface. On the other side of the undercurrent, the people of the second prince were also wondering why the Fan family had sent the people involved in the murder of the brothel to the capital government. Ever since Mei Zhili had changed positions, this important yamen had always been under the control of the second prince. The other party must have known that the capital government was within the scope of the second prince's power. If the Fan family was prepared to shed all pretense of cordiality and send the second young master to the authorities for investigation, then why was it that there was only news of the second young master being grounded? There was no sign of the Overwatch Council or the Fan family making a move. The second prince was having a headache over this matter. He had no idea that the Fan family would so decisively expel Fanxia from the capital and quietly send him to a foreign country. The Overwatch Council's work was flawless, but there was still a faint worry that prompted the second prince to begin making preparations. But now that things had come to a head, they realized that they had nothing to do with the Bayou house. They were innocent. Even if they were to guard against Fanxian's revenge, they did not know what Fanxian could possibly do to them. So how could they guard against him? No one could grasp Fanxian's thoughts. No one could guess Sir Yen Jr.'s ability to execute. On this day, the wind was gentle and the clouds were light. The yellow leaves were falling, and it was a perfect day for a trip outside the capital. There were still 6 days until the day of the royal family's chrysanthemum viewing. The officials and commoners of the capital had all brought their families to the outskirts of the capital. Since it was still daytime, the Bayou house was particularly quiet. Because the future was uncertain, and the owner was missing, the usually energetic receptionists were leaning against a pillar. The girls by the lake were forcing themselves to smile, and they were accompanying the old perverts who liked to indulge in daylight. Some unknown insects were hopping around the stone steps of the side corridor, crying out with all their might. They struggled to no avail, waiting for their end to come. The waiters in the building all looked a little uneasy. They picked up the rag and wiped the table. In the past, Fanxia had given strict orders that the table had to be tested with a white silk. They had to confirm that there was not a speck of dust on it before it passed. How could it be as easy as it was now? Suddenly, someone walked in. This person's eyebrows were very thick, and they looked as if they had been painted on. Although this appearance was not out of the ordinary, it was very easy to remember. So, one of the receptionists who had received him one night immediately recognized him. He froze next to the door of the Bayou house. His body sprung up, but he did not dare go forward to greet him. It was one of the waiters who looked at the receptionist strangely. He neatly put the gray rag in his hand on the table and sang, "A guest has arrived." The end of his voice was crisp and very pleasant to listen to. The person who came was slightly startled, and a wry smile appeared on his face. It seemed that there was a great deal of difficulty in his heart. He stood in the incomparably wide hall of the Bayou house for a while. Finally, he could not help but shake his head and say, "Tell Si Ching to come see me." This time, it was the waiter's turn to be shocked. He thought to himself that this guest was very arrogant. He wanted Si Ching to come see him personally, and he even called her by her name. There were many nobles in the capital, but of those who came to the Bayou house, who did not treat Si Ching with respect. The receptionist, who knew this person, finally came to his senses. He wiped away the cold sweat on his forehead and ran in front of the person. He respectfully said, "Sir, I will go and inform you immediately." He then asked the waiters to lead the person to the second floor of the third floor. It was the quietest room in the Bayou house, and he ordered the waiters to take good care of him. When the person went upstairs, the waiters and waiters on the first floor surrounded him. They did not stop talking, and they did not know which deity had come. The Bayou house was currently in a state of turmoil, but the people's hearts were already wavering. The slightest movement would cause everyone to feel uneasy. Finally, someone remembered that this person with thick eyebrows, who looked like an ordinary scholar, was actually the companion of young Master Chen, who came to visit the prostitute that day. Who was Mr. Chen? It was the brother of the owner of the Bayou house. It was Mr. Fan, the most popular person in the government. The person who had come was Mr. Fan's confidant, and it was likely that he was a high-ranking official in the Overwatch Council. Everyone in the brothel was stunned. They all knew what had happened that day. The brothel had offended Mr. Fan, and even the owner had suffered. Today, someone else had come. Was it possible that the Overwatch Council was going to raid the brothel again? Could the Bayou house continue to operate? At this time, someone sighed and said, "I think the brothel will have to pay a large sum of money to settle this. It is a shame. Although the owner is a bit cruel, he is very good at business. For no reason at all, he has to feed the mouths of these officials. No matter how good the business is, it will be ruined." Bah! Someone could not bear to see him pretend to be the great priest of the Qing temple. He laughed and said, "You idiot! The owner of the Bayou house is Mr. Fan's brother. If the Overwatch Council wanted to collect money, it would not come to us. Do you think the two of them are going to collect money from each other? There's even an old minister overseeing them." The man's face was cut, and he mumbled, "Then what is this person doing here with Commissioner Fan?" It was Shi Chanli. Fan Xian was having a good time, and Shi Chanli was a scholar. He had been chased to a brothel by his teacher, so it was only natural that he was in a bad mood. Si Chinger's eyes flashed, and she respectfully offered him tea. She knew that although the man in front of her was not an official, he was a trusted aide of Commissioner Fan. The owner had been missing for the past few days, and now that he had suddenly appeared, she had no idea what he was here for. She paused and then gently asked, "Mr. Shi, what brings you here today?" Shi Chanli hesitated for a moment. Si Chinger was someone that the third prince had picked out. She didn't have much of a relationship with the Fan family, so when she saw him hesitate, she misunderstood his intentions. She covered her lips and smiled. "We are all family now. Does Mr. Shi still want to raid our building?" When she said the word raid, her tongue curled. It was a strange sound. Sir Cholmondeley's eyebrows furrowed, and he did not like this woman's flippancy. His face darkened, and he pulled out a document. In a low voice, he said, "Today, I am not here to raid the brothel. I am here to take over." Take over? Si Chinger froze. She picked up the thin document from the table and quickly scanned it. Her face changed, and when she saw the red fingerprints at the bottom, she bit her lip. After a moment of silence, she finally digested the shock in her heart. She opened her eyes wide and asked, "The owner has given you all of the brothel's shares?" Her voice was filled with shock and disbelief. 70% of the Bayou brothel shares were worth a lot of money. How could it be so easily transferred? Si Chinger knew that this matter was not as simple as it seemed. She frowned and said, "Mr. Sher, this is too big a deal. I cannot accept it." Sir Cholmondeley gave a wry smile and said, "I do not need you to accept it. From today onwards, I am the owner of the Bayou brothel. I am only here to inform you." Si Chinger gritted her teeth and said, "Mr. Sher, if I may ask, where is the owner? This is such a big deal, and I have to talk to him face to face." Sir Cholmondeley was good at writing, and the document he had drafted a few nights ago was clean and simple. He did not expect that in the end, he would be forced by Fan Hsien to become the owner of the brothel. He was already uncomfortable with the situation, and he felt as if he had been caught in a trap of his own making. Hearing the question being asked, he coldly said, "Is this transfer document fake? Don't waste my time. The people who will be checking the accounts will be here soon. Don't even think about it." Si Chinger sensed that the Fan family was preparing to leave the Bayou brothel and use the scholar in front of her as a cover. But her rank was not high enough, and she did not know much about what was going on. Master Yuan had suddenly disappeared, and so she said, "Since the Bayou brothel is going to be owned by Sir Cholmondeley, I am just trying to make a living. How could I dare to argue with you?" Her heart had calmed down, and she smiled and said, "But this brothel still has 30% of its shares in the hands of that young man. I am sure you know this, Mr. Sher." No matter what was said, as long as the third prince's shares were in the Bayou brothel, the Fan family would not be able to get rid of the Bayou brothel. She did not know that Fan Hsien had no intention of getting rid of the Bayou brothel in the first place. Sir Cholmondeley looked at her and suddenly laughed. His thick eyebrows twitched and he said, "Today, I am closing the brothel because I would like to trouble you, Miss Chinger. Please tell the second owner that I will be taking the 30% shares." "I will be taking them? How arrogant of you!" Si Chinger said angrily. She thought it was easy for the Fan family to give and take, but she did not expect them to take the third prince's shares. How could it be so easy? Sir Cholmondeley had finally gotten into the role of the brothel owner, and he calmly said, "If you want to take the 30% shares, I have many ways of doing so. Bringing it up now is to give face to the second owner. Miss Chinger, you must understand this." Si Chinger coldly said, "Oh? It looks like I have to thank you, Mr. Sher. But I do not know, how much money are you willing to pay?" Sir Cholmondeley extended a finger. 100,000? Si Chinger asked, confused. She thought this was a fair price. Even if the Bayou brothel continued to operate well, 100,000 for 20% of the shares was a good price to pay. Sir Cholmondeley shook his head. "Only 10,000? Si Chinger was shocked. "I only have 1,000 liang of silver," Sir Cholmondeley said sincerely. "Scholars are always poor. You are too much." Si Chinger angrily shouted, "Do not think that the Fan family can hide the truth. Do not forget who these 30% shares belong to." Sir Cholmondeley raised an eyebrow and calmly said, "Miss, do not misunderstand. These 70% shares belong to me, Sir Cholmondeley. It has nothing to do with the Fan family or the Kai family. As for who the 30% shares belong to, I do not care." Si Chinger coldly said, "What if I do not give up the 30% shares? First of all, the Bayou brothel may be found with a copy of some of their letters, such as colluding with a foreign country. As for what the charges are, I am not sure. Sir Chanley smiled and said, Second, the Bowery brothel will soon appear in the capital. Since I own 70% of the shares, I can chase away all of the workers, customers, and girls. Then, the Bowery brothel will hire them again. Miss Chinger, think about it. The Bowery brothel, which has not yet existed, can take down the Bowery brothel in a short period of time? Si Chinger looked determined and she refused to back down. She said, I do not believe the first point. Would the Fan family, no, Mr. Sher, be willing to see the Bowery brothel collapse? Would they use 70% of the shares to take us down with them? She looked proud and said, The second point is even more impossible. When the owner chose the location, he was very particular about it. Plus, these girls have signed a death contract with us. How could they just leave? Sir Chanley shook his head and sighed. Miss Chinger, it looks like you still do not understand the situation. You have to understand that I am the owner of the Bowery brothel. What death contract or living contract? Si Chinger's face changed. Sir Chanley stood up and pushed open the window. He smiled and said, As for the location of the Bowery brothel, I will not hide it from you. It is to the side of the Bowery brothel, and it is also near Thin Lake. The reason why I came back after a few days was because 2 days ago, I was busy collecting the title deed for the land. Si Chinger was speechless. Sir Chanley was now completely immersed in his role as a ruthless businessman. He waved his hand to catch the wind from Thin Lake and continued to say, As for taking me down with you, if you do not want to back out, then I will take you down with me. 70% of the Bowery brothel's shares may be worth a lot of money, but I do not care for it. After he said this, he laughed at himself. When did he begin to wash away his status as a scholar? Instead, he began to indulge in a life of bullying others? He was indeed threatening Si Chinger, but this kind of threat was easy to make. It seemed simple, but it was difficult for her, or rather, the third prince, to respond. The land next to the Bowery brothel had indeed been purchased by the Overwatch Council, but no one knew what methods had been used. Sir Chanley knew that every step of taking over the brothel had been done in a very stable manner. There was no need to worry about any mistakes. Mr. Yen Bingyun was very powerful. If the third prince did not want to give up the 30% of the shares, Mr. Yen Bingyun had a way to make the Bowery brothel close down within 10 days. Lady, you do not know the root of this matter. Do not think too much about it. Sir Chanley did not need her to send a message to the third prince. The news that Fan Xian wanted to take over the Bowery brothel had already been passed through the Fan Manor and into the ears of Yi Gui Pin, who was in the palace. Now, the third prince was forced to copy books by Yi Gui Pin every day. Even if he felt bad that his money had been stolen by his cousin, he could not find a way to stop this. He looked at Si Chinger's confused face, and the gentle nature of a scholar came into play. He smiled and said, I am a very easy person to talk to. In the future, if you continue to work in the brothel and do your best, I will not mistreat you. Who knew that Si Chinger was such a stubborn person? She always wanted to be responsible for the second owner? Although the second owner was only a young child, she thought of the child's identity and thought the whole thing was ridiculous. In the capital, it was common for people to steal property, but how could someone dare to steal property from a prince? If the second owner sends a message, I will agree. She gritted her teeth and said, But the money in the account, you and I have to make sure to settle it properly. It cannot be messed up. Sir Chanley nodded. The group of people who had been waiting outside the brothel finally entered. Seeing the group of people, Si Chinger's eyes widened. They were all Overwatch Council secret agents in casual clothing. They were still secret agents. With such a group of people coming to take over the brothel, who would dare to stop them? When she saw the old man with the long beard in the middle of the group, who was praising the Bowery brothel, Si Chinger could not help but take a deep breath. She was speechless, thinking that no matter how hard she tried, she would not be able to stop Fan Xian from taking the third prince's money. With the third Yi shopkeeper of Qingyu Hall personally taking over, no matter how the accounts were calculated, she was afraid that the Baoyu brothel would end up being owned by the Shi family, no, the goddamn Fan family. He would not choke, and perhaps he would not even bother to drink a bowl of water. Chapter 298. The shopkeepers of Qingyu Hall had always felt the pulse of the palace treasury and managed the businesses of the various kings. It had been many years since they had made an appearance. But Si Qing'er was a girl who had worked her way up from being a prostitute to being a top-notch madam. She was someone who was willing to learn, had a desire to improve, and had a deep understanding of the ways of business. She knew the old men of Qingyu Hall well. As long as they were in business, they all had a deep respect for the elders of the Yi family. It was the same as how the scholars of the world looked at Zhuang Mohan. So when Si Qing'er saw the three-leaf shopkeeper arrive, she immediately gave up all thoughts of playing tricks on the account. She was even more prepared to lose everything. She gracefully stepped forward and respectfully bowed. The three-leaf shopkeeper was probably in his 50s, and the beard on his chin was dyed white. He looked at Si Qing'er's beautiful face and nodded his head in appreciation. Shi Chanli was frozen to the side, wondering why Master Xian had sent such an old pervert. The three-leaf sighed and said, "This lady? You must be the owner of this building. I look at the location of the building, the lighting, and the decorations. They are all the work of a genius. I am truly impressed. If you are willing to continue to stay in the building, I will return to Commissioner Fan. There is no need for my old bones to meddle." Si Qing'er looked embarrassed and said, "You are too kind. Everything in this building is the work of the owner. It has nothing to do with me." The third Yi shopkeeper had a look of pity on his face. He sighed and said, "This big boss is indeed a genius in business. How could he offend Fan?" Fortunately, he was old and not stupid. He knew his words were going too far, so he quickly shut his mouth under the gaze of Shi Chanli, who looked at him like he was an old monster. He only shook his head vigorously and looked around. His expression was full of the sigh of someone who was at the peak of Dong Mountain but did not see any aces. In the eyes of the old shopkeepers of Qingyu Hall, who had been involved in the business for 20 years, although the Baoyu brothel was a shady business, the building was very bright. There was a lake behind the building, and there was a courtyard by the lake. The waiters knew when to stop, and they knew how to be polite. The girls were not arrogant, and they did not lose their composure. It was a perfect fit for the hearts of the customers. The man who was in charge of all of this was a man who had a deep understanding of business. The old shopkeeper sighed. Shi Chanli couldn't help but shake his head, thinking that the second young master of the Fan family was not a simple son of a noble family. It was a wonderful thing, though. The two brothers of the Fan family were different from the rest of the world. There had been no news from the palace, so Si Qing'er did not dare make a decision about the third prince's money. But now that the collection team had arrived, they had to bring out the account books for both parties to check. Although most businesses in the Qin kingdom had open accounts and secret accounts, in front of the three-leaf shopkeeper, Si Qing'er did not dare play any trick. In the time it takes to burn a stick of incense, the Baoyu brothel's money had been clearly accounted for. The 30% of the shares, which had been converted into 1,000 liang of silver, had been temporarily separated. All that was left was to wait for the news from the third prince. After that, the entire Baoyu brothel would become Shi Chanli's business. After finishing all of this, Si Qing'er thought that the next owner of the Baoyu brothel would be the three-leaf shopkeeper of Qingyu Hall. She did not expect the old shopkeeper to leave in a carriage, which surprised Si Qing'er. What surprised her even more was that the new owner of the Baoyu brothel was someone she knew. Sang-won. Si Qing'er was stunned, but she quickly came to her senses. After Fan Xian had forcefully bought Sang-won away, there had been no news of her. Now she was back. Sir Chandley looked at her expression and said, "Not bad. This Lady Sang will be the owner of the Bao brothel from now on." Si Chinger forced herself to bow to Sangwon. Back when they were in the brothel, Sangwon was always cold and unyielding because of her reputation. It was inevitable that Si Chinger would make things difficult for her. Now that she had become the owner of the Bao brothel, she knew she would not have a good time. She suppressed the anger in her chest and prepared to return to her room to pack up her belongings. Sangwon was a little uneasy. Mr. Fan had treated her well, and since he had given her the responsibility of managing the Bao brothel, she had to take care of it properly. But she was also a little afraid of the third prince's power. Seeing that Si Chinger was willing to back down, she felt relieved. Sir Chandley furrowed his eyebrows and said, "Lady Chinger, you cannot leave." Si Chinger coldly laughed and said, "I did not sign a contract with the Bao brothel. Why can't I leave?" Sir Chandley felt a headache coming on and loosened the buttons on his collar. After thinking for a while, he said, "I have never run a brothel before. Lady Sang is only a singer. If you leave, I do not know if the Bao brothel will be able to make money." Si Chinger now knew that he still needed her. She couldn't help but feel proud of herself. She smiled and said, "If," before she could finish her sentence, Sir Chandley cut her off and said, "Mr. Fan has said that if he does not say anything, you are not allowed to leave the Bao brothel." Si Chinger was angry. She finally understood that it was not that he needed her, but rather that he wanted her dead. She was just a woman. Even if she had some connection to the third prince, if the commissioner of the Overwatch Council had spoken, how could she say no? In this world, there was no official who would go against the Overwatch Council for the sake of a prostitute. Not even the princes would do something like that. If Mr. Fan wanted to destroy her, it would be easier than killing an ant. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, a little absent-mindedly. Sir Chandley said, "Mr. Fan. Oh no, I am going to make some small changes to the Bao brothel. I think Lady Chinger will be of some use in this. Perhaps in the future, all the brothels in the Qing kingdom will need these changes." Si Chinger was shocked. The Bao brothel's business was doing well, so the big boss had already used some of his capital to open up more branches in other provinces. But as of now, the brothel business in the Qing kingdom did not have a large share. As for changes, this was how the brothel business had been run since ancient times. Unless, like the big boss, the brothel made some changes to its operations. Was Fan Xian really going to go crazy and stop all the prostitutes in the world from selling? But the problem was, if the prostitutes did not sell, and if the pimps did not take in customers, would it still be a brothel? Sir Chandley did not know what she was thinking, and so he followed the instructions of his teacher and said, "First, the girls in the brothel, from this day forward, are to change their death contracts to living contracts. This will be for 5 years, and when the time is up, they will be free to go. Second, the Bao brothel must have a doctor to ensure that the girls are healthy, and only then can they receive customers. Third." Before he finished, Si Chinger was confused and asked, "Change to living contracts? What is the need for that?" Sir Chandley explained, "Sir. Ahem, I was wrong again. I thought that in this line of work, 5 years is the limit. We have to give people something to think about. If they think that they can only be ridden by others for the rest of their lives, and that there is no chance of them being redeemed, the girls will be in a bad mood. Naturally, they will not be able to treat the guests well." Si Chinger mockingly said, "5 years is up. Do you think we, poor women, can stop selling? Who is going to remove their registration?" The brothels of the Qing kingdom were not registered. Once a prostitute became a prostitute, she could not leave the brothel for the rest of her life, unless she was redeemed, or the government had given them a special order. According to what was said before, the Bao brothel signed a living contract for 5 years. After 5 years, the prostitutes in the brothel would not be able to escape. Regarding this question, Sir Chandley did not answer. Master Xian had said that he would deal with it in the future. Si Qing'er mockingly said, "As for the doctors, that is even more ridiculous. The girls in the brothel are of low status, and no doctor would be willing to visit them. It is difficult to even see a patient, so how could there be a doctor who would be willing to stay in the brothel? Would the men be willing to lose face like that?" Sangwon, who had been silent this entire time, smiled and said, "The commissioner said that he has many students in the third bureau of the Overwatch Council. Hiring a few doctors would not be a problem." Si Qing'er gave a wry smile and thought to herself that the third bureau of the Overwatch Council was the poison department that everyone feared. Was he going to become a doctor? She increasingly felt that Fan Xian was a man who only knew how to dream. She mockingly said, "So what if there are doctors? Even if the girls are clean, who can guarantee that the guests will not suffer from venereal diseases?" Shi Chanli felt a headache coming on and said, I do not have a good idea." It was not that he did not have a good idea. It was that Fan Xian's idea of industrializing prostitution had run into the problem of not being able to popularize condoms. Listen to the last few things first. He coughed and continued to say, "From now on, things like forced buying and selling cannot happen again. If something like this happens again, you will be held responsible." He stared into Si Qing'er's eyes until she lowered her head. "Things like young prostitutes cannot happen again. There should be a rule for drawing water, and it should be based on the brands of the girls. The girls should have 3 days off every month, and they can do whatever they want." As Big Boss Shi continued to speak, not only did Si Qing'er's face change, but even Sangwon was dazzled. Finally, Si Qing'er could not help but open her eyes wide and say, "If this goes on, is the Baoyu brothel a brothel or a charity hall?" Shi Chanli looked at her and said, "The master has said that you are someone who was raised by Yuan Xian. Logically speaking, he should punish you. But because of your poor background, he will give you a chance to redeem yourself. You do not need to worry about whether the Baoyu brothel is a brothel or a charity hall. In any case, you should follow Lady Sang's lead and do your business. If you succeed in this endeavor, you can spread it all over the world. In the future, hundreds of thousands of girls in this brothel will be indebted to you. Consider it repaying the debt you have owed over the past few months." At this point, Shi Chanli finally brought up Fan Xian's name without hesitation. Si Qing'er was silent, and no one knew what she was thinking. Her face was full of fear. In fact, Shi Chanli's heart was full of fear. Although the Baoyu brothel would be monitored by Sangwon, who had already joined the first bureau of the Overwatch Council, he was a scholar and a student of Fan Xian. Would he never be able to become an official? Would he only be able to stay in a brothel and be the owner of a brothel? He looked at Sangwon and found that this woman, who had been a singer, was calm and steady. It did not seem as if she was troubled by this. A few days later, there was an autumn rain midway, and it was mournful and rustling, forcefully turning the clear autumn air into a cold, rainy night. The Baoyu brothel had been taken over by Fan Xian, and the second prince had already sensed an ominous omen. He had begun to make arrangements. Fan Xian, on the other hand, appeared to be rather relaxed. These few days, he did not go to the first bureau, nor did he go to Xinfeng restaurant to eat buns. Instead, he went to the Imperial College, and with a group of young teachers, he organized the carriage of books he had brought back from northern Qi. The autumn wind blew, and the water droplets that had been hanging on the clouds for a while finally fell. They were so sparse that it was irritating. From Danbo bookstore, Fan Xian walked north for a while, and then he arrived at the gate of the Imperial College. A large area here was managed by the Imperial College and the Tunguen Pavilion. The government offices that had been set up in the first year of the Qing calendar had long been dismantled. Fan Xian raised his black umbrella and walked among the students of the Imperial College. Occasionally, he would nod and greet the students who respectfully greeted him. Although his status was different from before, the emperor had not removed him from his fifth-level official position. Furthermore, he had given verbal orders for him to come to the imperial college when he had time. Although he did not like being a teacher and had never come to class, he used his official position to come to the imperial college to read books and hide from the wind and rain outside. He was very willing to do so. The first day he came to the imperial college, the students could not help but be surprised. It had been almost a year since Sir Fan Jr. had come to the Imperial College. When the students thought of this young man, who now held a position in the Overwatch Council, they could not help but feel a sense of conflict and fear. They were not as enthusiastic as they had been a year ago. It was not until a few hours later that they realized Sir Fan Jr. was as easy to get along with as he had been in the past that they became lively again. Arriving outside the study that the Imperial College had left for him, Fan Xian put away his umbrella and looked at the gloomy weather outside. He could not help but frown and push open the door to enter. Inside the room, a few of the Imperial College's teachers were organizing the books that Zhuang Mohan had given them. For the kingdom of Qing, the books in this carriage had a very beautiful symbolic meaning. The emperor greatly valued them, so the Imperial College did not dare to be negligent. The work of copying and maintaining the books was being carried out in an orderly manner. Seeing Sir Fan enter, the teachers hurriedly stood up and bowed. Fan Xian smiled and returned the greeting. The people in front of him were all mediocre and unaccomplished people. Because it was difficult for him to repair Zhuang Mohan's books by himself, he had forcibly taken them from the Imperial College. They had gotten along quite well over the past few days. The black cloth umbrella was placed in a corner, and water began to seep through the floor. There was a dark stove in the room, and as the two warmed, Fan Xian suddenly felt the humidity in the room increase. Feeling a little uncomfortable, he loosened his collar and said, "It's not good to be too wet. The weather is not cold yet. Sir, let us endure it for a while. How about we put out the stove?" One of the teachers explained, "Books need a certain temperature to be stored. It's not good to be too cold." Fan Xian knew this and said, "It's not winter yet. It should be fine to leave these books in the room. It's not good to be too damp either." Everyone agreed, and began to bury their heads in their work. The Imperial College had inherited the style of the kingdom of Qing's court. It paid attention to practical matters, and was not easy to talk about. It was very different from northern Qi. Fan Xian sat back down at his table, but before he had time to start working, he was asked to leave. Someone wanted to see him. "Why have you returned to the Imperial College today?" Fan Xian was a little surprised to see Shu Wu the scholar sitting in a chair, and he bowed respectfully. After his father-in-law, the Prime Minister, had stepped down, and the Minister of the Board of Rights had been hanged, the civil officials in the court had become a mess. Some were secretly watching Fan Xian, and some were following the Eastern Palace. Instead, it was the second prince, who had always been quiet, who, because of his many years of business and literary fame, had the most support from the civil officials. Shu Wu the scholar had once been a student of Zhuang Mohan, and had always had a great reputation. In terms of seniority, he was second to none in the court. But because he had passed the imperial examination in Northern Wei, he was now an official in the kingdom of Qing, so there was always a problem. In the turmoil of the 5th year of the Qing calendar, he had accidentally obtained the greatest benefit. Although he had been stripped of his position as Chancellor of the Imperial College, the original scholar of the Tunwen Pavilion had been implicated in the spring examination incident and had been removed from his position. Shu Wu the scholar was extremely noble. The scholar of the Tunwen Pavilion was extremely noble. With the removal of the Prime Minister and the absence of a new Prime Minister, the scholar of the Tunwen Pavilion had to enter the palace to discuss matters. He had truly entered the center of the Qing court and was equivalent to a prime minister. No matter how powerful Fan Xian was in front of him, he was still just an unranked official. Of course, Shu Wu the scholar was not stupid enough to see Fan Xian as a common official. If that was the case, he would not have come to find Fan Xian today. If Commissioner Fan can calmly return to the Imperial College, why can't I? Shu Wu joked with Fan Xian, who was about the same age as his son. It's cold outside, and you, a young man, know how to enjoy life and hide in the Imperial College. What? You don't want the Overwatch Council to be drenched in the rain? Cold wind and rain outside? Fan Xian did not know if Shu Wu the scholar's words had a hidden meaning. He smiled, not knowing how to respond. After Shi Chanli took over the Baoyue house, Yan Bingyun's actions began to unfold. First, he used the pressure of the Overwatch Council to force the Ministry of Justice to bypass the capital government. He directly issued an arrest warrant, focusing on a few crimes, and began to track down Yuan Meng. But Yuan Meng could really hide. Under the cover of King Jing's son, Hong Qing, no one knew where she was hiding. Fan Xian was not in a hurry. After all, issuing the arrest warrant was to lay the groundwork for what would happen next. The later Yuan Meng was caught, the better. In Yan Bingyun's plan, everything was connected. As long as he could achieve the results he wanted, it was fine. Just 2 days ago, rumors began to spread throughout the capital. It was said that the brothel owner Yuan Meng, who the Ministry of Justice had been searching for, was actually the mistress of King Jing's son, Li Hongqing. Rumors spread easily, especially since Yuan Meng and Li Hongqing were in a relationship. So, the capital was abuzz with discussion. Li Hongqing's reputation was like a piece of juicy meat on a hot day, and it was only a matter of time before his reputation became worse. Li Hongqing and the second prince were friends, and this was something everyone knew. Not long after, another rumor began to spread. The famous Baoyue house in the capital was, in fact, the second prince. The case of the missing prostitutes being investigated by the Ministry of Justice was inextricably linked to the royal family. These rumors were very convincing. For example, Yuan Meng used to be a popular figure on Lujing River, but aside from the prince, no one had ever seen her take on any other customers. Another rumor was that on a certain day, the second prince had a long conversation with Commissioner Fan of the Overwatch Council outside of the Baoyue house. Although no one knew what the conversation was about, the next day, the Fan family sold their shares of the Baoyue house to a mysterious businessman named Shi. These rumors were, of course, the work of the 8th Bureau of the Overwatch Council. When Fan Xian was forced to take up his post during the spring examination, he became the idol of the world's scholars. The Qing Kingdom's Wen'ing headquarter office, when it came to creating an image, they were very good at it. When it came to pouring dirty water, they did it very well. Of course, as the rumors spread, the people of the capital learned that the original owner of the Baoyue house was actually the second master of the Fan family. The reputation of the Fan family was affected by this. But the source of the rumors was in the hands of the Fan family. They randomly tossed out a few stories about Commissioner Fan beating his brother, the old minister punishing the family, the second master breaking his leg, and the howling of evil in the garden. The Fan family selling the brothel at a loss was enough to shock the people of the capital. In addition, the Fan family no longer had anything to do with the Baoyue house, so the rumors quickly died down. When it came to controlling public opinion, Fan Xian was very familiar with it. Back then, Wu Zhu had written a few thousand leaflets, and he was able to chase the eldest princess out of the palace. Now, he was dealing with the second prince, who was even more immature. Therefore, the people of the capital always believed that the second prince and Li Hongqing, who did not have any shares in the Baoyue house, were the true culprits behind the Baoyue house case. Fan Xian, on the other hand, was an innocent man. The Fan family must have had their reasons for doing so. Yan Bingyun's next step was to deal with the money between the second prince and the Cui family. Not even Fan Xian knew the specifics, but he trusted Yan Bingyun's abilities. He didn't want to get involved in this. Shu Wu, the scholar, looked at him and said with concern, "Did you know that yesterday the capital government accepted the Baoyu House case? Your second son's crime is not light. He committed murder, silenced witnesses, and forced prostitution. Today is the day he will be tried." Fan Xian gave a wry smile and said, "It is unfortunate that our family has produced such an unfilial son." Shu Wu shook his head and said, "The capital government has not yet gone to the manor to ask for him. I think they have other plans. Mr. Fan, the word trial is the most harmful. There is not much room for negotiation in a criminal case. If the capital government continues with the trial, the emperor will be alerted. I don't think it will end well." After this conversation, Fan Xian knew where the scholar stood. He was speaking on behalf of the civil servants in the court, and he was advising the Fan family to live in peace with the second prince. Not to mention the problem of the court's reputation, these elders believed that when two tigers fought, one would be hurt. Both Fan Xian and the second prince were the best of the Qing kingdom's younger generation. It didn't matter who lost in this fight, it would be a loss for the Qing kingdom. Of course, most people did not think Fan Xian had the right to fight a prince, even though he was the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. Fan Xian understood this, and so he knew that the scholar in front of him was trying to make peace for his sake. He couldn't help but feel touched. He smiled warmly and said, "Thank you for your advice. I believe you have already met the second prince." Shu Wu nodded. Ever since Fan Xian returned to the capital from northern Qi, he had been at odds with the second prince. The Overwatch Council had arrested many of the second prince's officials, and if he wanted to make peace, he had to first ask the second prince for his opinion. He did not expect the second prince to be so easy to talk to, and politely asked Shu Wu to speak on Fan Xian's behalf. Hearing Shu the scholar's words, Fan Xian laughed coldly in his heart. The second prince's nickname was Stone. How could he be so easy to get along with? The two sides had already shed all pretenses of cordiality, and he had been forced to send his brother to a distant foreign land. There had to be an explanation for the matter of his father-in-law being taken down by the eldest princess and the second prince, right? Furthermore, the spies of the First Bureau of the Overwatch Council had already sent word that the second prince had already brought back the 3 killers of the Baoyu brothel, who had been hidden in secret. They were preparing to bring Fan Xizha back to the capital's court. The second prince had asked Shu Wu to speak on his behalf to temporarily calm Fan Xian down. Fan Xian was not that stupid, though. He respectfully offered tea to Shu Wu and said, "This has nothing to do with the council, and it has nothing to do with me. I have been guarding the Imperial College these past few days, because I was afraid someone might misunderstand." Shu Wu could not help but smile wryly. The wrinkles on his face were full of pity, and he said, "Why fight with him? Even if we win this time, so what? No matter how many times we win, it cannot compare to the happiness of the Emperor." Fan Xian's heart jumped, and he knew that these words were true. He felt even more grateful to the old scholar in front of him. Although he had other thoughts in his heart, he still responded warmly, "Since you have spoken, then I have nothing else to say. As long as the capital government leaves the Fan family some face, the Ministry of Justice case will not be investigated too deeply." In the eyes of an old official like Shu Wu, Fan Xian's reply seemed a bit rash. In the officialdom, there was always a need to conceal one's dignity. How could there be such a clear and unmistakable reason to talk about such illegal matters in front of the Prime Minister? But he also knew that Fan Xian's personality was like this. He smiled in satisfaction and did not say anything. He only watched the rain outside the window of the Imperial College. 3 li from the Jingdo government office, by the side of the Imperial Mountain Road, the autumn rain was falling heavily. The case of the missing prostitutes in the Baoyu brothel had already been investigated. Although the bodies had not yet been found, the capital government had already found the 3 murderers involved in the murder. If the 3 men who killed the prostitutes were arrested and brought to justice, then they would be able to claim that the second master of the Fan family was the mastermind behind the incident. This would be a huge blow to the Fan family, and it would also clear the second prince's name. So, these 3 men were important figures. The second prince's people still did not understand why the Fan family had sent these 3 men to the capital government after carrying out the family's punishment. Did this not give them something to use against them? But it was not until the Fan family sold the Baoyu brothel and began to investigate Yuan Meng and point their finger at Li Hongqing that the second prince realized that Fan Xian was using these 3 men to make him feel better. He thought he had chosen peace, and so his reaction was delayed for a few days. But the second prince still felt that Fan Xian was being unwise. As long as these 3 men were in his hands, where could the fat, pockmarked man of the Fan family run to? Now, the second prince was truly angry. Fan Xian really did not know how high the sky was and how deep the earth was. He dared to make a move against the second prince. Even the ghosts knew that the rumors in the capital were spread by him. At this time, although Crown Prince Hongqing was also very depressed, he could not go to the Fan Manor to fight Fan Xian. This was because King Jing was the first to get angry. After a beating, he locked him up in the manor to avoid the storm that was brewing in the capital. Watch him carefully. Do not let anyone else have the opportunity to come in contact with him. Do not give them the opportunity to retract their statements. Fan Wujiu, one of the 8 generals of the second prince's manor, had a gloomy expression on his face. He said to the bailiffs sent by the capital government, "If you fail this mission, be careful of your own life." The bailiffs of the capital government nervously nodded. He was not nervous about this mission, but he was nervous about facing the 8 generals of the second prince. Yushan Road was only 3 miles away from the capital government. If it were not for the fact that he wanted to avoid suspicion, Fan Wujiu would have personally escorted these 3 men to the capital government's prison. The carriage began to move, and in the dark autumn rain, Fan Wujiu watched from afar. The carriage traveled in the rain, as usual. There were not many people on the street, and only a few passers-by with umbrellas in their hands walked by. At this time, the passers-by began to move. They flipped their umbrellas and pulled out sharp, black-stained weapons. Calmly, they stabbed into the carriage. Fan Wujiu was shocked and rushed in that direction. But he was still some distance away from the carriage. Seeing the speed at which these people were moving, he knew he would not be able to save them in time. The sharp needles were as sharp as tofu. They pierced into the walls of the carriage and killed the 3 people inside. The passers-by pulled out the needles and did not make any unnecessary movement. Holding their umbrellas, they walked into the alleys on the side of the street and disappeared into the rain. Fresh blood flowed from the carriage. Fan Wujiu rushed over with a cold face. He pulled open the curtain and his face changed. The wounds all showed how professional the person who did it was. It was only a simple stab, and they were already dead. Fan Wujiu could not help but take a deep breath. He began to worry for the second prince. To kill the 3 people in the carriage so cleanly was already difficult. What was even more frightening was that the other side knew exactly when they would move the witnesses. It seemed that the Overwatch Council had hidden many spies in the second prince's camp, which was why they were able to control the timing and location of the attack so well. This assassination was so perfectly planned that it looked so natural and simple. It was like eating a meal, and it was not very thrilling. Only an expert like Fan Wujiu could find a soul-stirring feeling in such a plain killing situation. He did not need to think to know who had done it. Other than the assassins of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council, who always hid in the dark, who else could have done it? His face grew paler. He could not help but think, if those passers-by had been trying to assassinate him, would he have been able to survive? Everyone in the second prince's camp seemed to have underestimated Fan Xian's power. That was because the new generation of people in the kingdom of Qing did not know How terrifying the Overwatch Council was. Fan Wujiu nervously rubbed the dagger in his sleeve. For the first time, he felt that he should leave the second prince and save himself. My chess skills are not good. I play chess because I don't want to take the pieces, Fan Xian said with a face full of shame. He was playing chess with Xu Wu at the Imperial College. The court had ended early, and the disaster relief in the south was almost over. That was why Xu the scholar had so much free time. After only 2 rounds of chess, the old man found that Fan Xian, such an intelligent and quick-witted genius, was a complete and utter lousy chess player. He could not help but change his expression. He felt that playing this kind of chess, even if he won, would not be fun. Xu Wu sighed and said, Fan Xian, I see that you are very clever in everything you do. How is it that you are so lousy at chess? The two of them casually talked about the matters of the court. Because Minister Fan rarely talked about such things in the manor, and the Overwatch Council could not investigate their disputes in court, Fan Xian listened with great interest. He smelled some of the important matters of court that he could not touch with at his current rank. Now, Yan Xiaoyi was the governor in the north and endlessly stretched out his hand for silver. The small battles in the south were also ongoing. The kingdom of Qing was currently lacking in silver. Fan Xian's heart was now at ease. As long as the emperor needed silver, the palace treasury would fall into his hands next year. The eldest princess was good at scheming, but when it came to making money from business, it was not very reassuring. The rain had stopped, and Fan Xian did not have the right to ask the old man to stay for a meal. He respectfully saw the scholar out the door, then turned around and returned to the room. He began to look through the collection of books that Master Zhuang had given him. After the teachers had left, he still had not left. He held a book in his hands, lost in thought. He knew what had happened in the capital today, but he did not take it to heart. The 3 people were already dead, but the families of the dead prostitutes had now come to the capital government to complain, pointing their fingers at the Fan family. Of course, Fan Xian would not kill them to silence them. The 3 people who had died today had been secretly hidden by the second prince. If he killed him, the second prince would not be able to report it to the emperor. Although Fan Xian was not a good person, he did not have the heart to kill the victims. In fact, he understood that if he did not care about his status, as the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, the resources and power he held were far greater than the second prince's. If there were no accidents in this battle, of course, he would win. But the world did not know this. The only thing that Fan Xian cared about was the attitude of the emperor in the palace. If the emperor felt that these little bastards playing around was nothing, then Fan Xian could continue to play. He actually had a good grasp of the emperor's thoughts. The second prince was just a whetstone. Although he was used to sharpen the crown prince, he was also used to sharpen the future Overwatch Council Director Fan Jr. Looking at Director Fan Jr.'s methods and thoughts, it seemed like a good choice. Of course, if Fan Xian really did go too far, the palace would only need to issue an edict to settle the matter. He was not worried that the emperor would hurt him because of this matter. On the contrary, he would laugh at himself and think, everyone is a bastard. You, the emperor, can't kiss one egg and kiss another. The rain in Jingdo stopped. He quietly avoided everyone's gaze and left the Imperial College. In a clothing store, he took off his outer garment, revealing the pure work clothes underneath. He then took a normal outer garment from the hands of the lowly shopkeeper and put it on. Only then did he flip over his rain hat to hide his face and disappear into the streets of Jingdo. The rain had already stopped. The leaden clouds in the sky seemed to have been melted by the sun. They gradually thinned and flattened, then gradually split apart. Following the arc of the sky, they flowed toward the 4 corners of the sky, revealing a large piece of blue sky in the center and the particularly fresh autumn day after their victory. The sun shone on the outside of the yamen of the capital government. A few rays of light penetrated into the hall, clearly illuminating the "Just and Honorable" sign in the hall. There was already a crowd gathered outside the capital government, waiting for the prefectural magistrate to personally investigate the Bauer brothel case, which had recently caused a stir. This case had a background, a murder, and involved a prostitute that made people's imaginations run wild. It happened in a place of pleasure, and it satisfied many of the aesthetic requirements of the people of Jingdo. Thus, it was the focus of everyone's attention. If one did not know much about this case, it would be embarrassing to speak up. If the carriage drivers did not know the whole story of this case, they would not have the face to drive a carriage for a customer. Fan Xian disguised himself as a passerby and blended into the crowd. He looked into the yamen and couldn't help but feel a strange feeling in his heart. The capital government was the most important yamen, and the changes in personnel in the last 2 years could not escape his involvement. He was afraid that once this matter was over, the Jingdo prefectural magistrate would have to apologize and resign. Chapter 299. The previous prefect of the capital, Mei Zhili, was a student of Lady Lu's father. He had always supported the Fan Manor, and during the Guo Baokuan Black Fist case, he had helped Fan Xian a great deal. After Fan Xian was assassinated on Yulon Street, Mei Zhili, as the prefect of the capital, was punished as well. His salary was forfeited for a year, and he was put on probation. But no one could have predicted that the next year there would be another assassination attempt. After much trouble, Mei Zhili was removed from his position and sent to another county. The Fan Manor and Mei Zhili still kept in touch with each other, so Fan Xian knew that Mei Zhili was very happy to leave the capital government. In the hall, there was a large row of people who looked very poor. They were kneeling in front of the table and crying. These people were the relatives of the prostitutes who had died in the Baoyu brothel. As they cried, they cursed the Fan family and they begged for justice. The current prefect of the capital government, Tian Jingmu, looked very righteous. His lips twitched and his eyes were wet. It seemed as if he had been moved by the words of the victims. He immediately ordered the servants of the government to go to the Baoyu brothel and arrest the suspects. They investigated the crime scene, and he solemnly expressed his desire to do justice for the people. He ordered people to go to the Fan Manor and ask for the second master of the Fan family, who had committed all sorts of crimes. He did not mention the names of Yuan Meng and the others. Fan Xian watched coldly from within the crowd. He could see the slight panic in the magistrate Tian Jingmu's eyes. He knew that the magistrate knew that the 3 thugs involved in the murder of the prostitutes were already dead. Fan Xian did not react to the cries of the victims in the hall. After all, the Baoyu brothel was responsible for the deaths of the prostitute. He and his brother were only cursed at, and that was nothing. He was just wondering if these victims were real, or if they had been arranged by the second prince. The results of the Overwatch Council's investigation had not yet been released, but he had to do something about it. The trials of the Jingdo government were very tedious. This kind of show had been performed many times over the past thousands of years. Although the commoners who were watching the excitement still enjoyed it, Fan Xian's mind had already turned elsewhere. The reason why he came here today was because he reckoned that something was about to happen. His father-in-law, the treacherous Prime Minister Lin Ruofu, was forced to step down in dejection. Although the root cause was his sudden appearance and the Emperor's heart, the actual fuse was Wu Bowen, who had died under the grape trellis. Because Peng Tingxing of Shandong Road had incited the Wu family and killed Wu Bowen's son, Wu Bowen's widow had come to the capital to complain. On the way, she had been intercepted by the people of the Prime Minister's manor, but had been saved by the second prince and Li Hongqing. Would the second prince do the same today? Fan Xian did not hold a grudge against his father-in-law, but he remembered the second prince's methods. Logically speaking, a true expert at scheming would never repeat his method. However, he had seen through the second prince. Although the second prince liked to squat on the chair and put on an unfathomable expression after so many days of probing, he had finally revealed the immaturity and stubbornness of a young man. Aside from the terrifying power of the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian had an advantage over the second prince. Although he was younger than the second prince in this life, in reality, he had much more experience. Not long after, the capital government's bailiffs had brought back the owner of the Baoyu brothel, Si Qinger. There were also people who were looking for clues in the lake behind the Baoyu brothel. But there were no direct witnesses, so they did not know where the bodies were buried. Fan Xian looked at the woman kneeling on the stone floor and wondered how she would deal with the situation. Would she be intimidated by the pressure and be more obedient, or would she still be unwilling to give up? As for the bodies that were buried in the Baoyu brothel, the Overwatch Council had already worked with Shi Chanli to retrieve them one night and bury them in the suburbs of the capital. They were waiting for the case to be concluded, and then they would find a way to notify their real families. Si Qinger, who was in the hall, bit her lips. Although she did not say anything, it was only when the old man above her asked her a question that she answered. Her heart was clear as a mirror. Before she came, Mr. Shi had already told her what she could say and what she could not. Fortunately, the owner of the house was not too strict. He did not ask her to do anything dirty, and he did not ask her to cover up for the second master of the Fan family. She only told him what she wanted. So, before the capital government's magistrate could begin his sentence, she told him the name of the owner of the Baoyu brothel and what he had done. But when it came to the murder of the prostitutes, she was adamant that it was Yuan Meng, who was wanted by the Ministry of Justice. Although the owner knew about it, he did not participate in it. The capital government's magistrate was pleased with how smoothly the kneeling woman had answered. But the more he listened, the more it seemed as if she was trying to clear the name of the second master of the Fan family. And the second prince had already told him that this matter could not be related to Yuan Meng. His face darkened, and he threw the stick in front of him and shouted, "This woman is very cunning. Beat her." The capital government's bailiffs picked up sticks and began to torture Si Qinger. Si Qinger gritted her teeth and endured the pain. She knew that the Fan family was watching. She no longer had the support of the third prince, and if she wanted to rely on the Fan family to survive in the capital, then she would have to go down the dark path. She endured the pain and did not speak, but it was not as if she could not scream. She cried out in pain, and there was a hidden bitterness in her voice. She floated around the capital government's yamen, and it made the people who were watching feel sorry for her. Fan Xian watched this from the outside, and he was surprised by the woman's cruelty. After the torture, Si Qinger continued to say the same things she had said before. The capital government's magistrate was about to begin another round of torture when the officials who had gone to the Fan Manor to arrest Fan Xizha came back, covered in dust and looking defeated. This group of people had gone to the Fan Manor to arrest Fan Xizha, and they had used the capital government's sign to force their way in. But at this time, Fan Xizha had probably already reached Sangzhou, and he was hugging Lady Yenner in his carriage, sighing about how difficult it was to leave his homeland. The bailiffs were about to ask a few more questions, but Lady Lu led a group of servants and beat them out with brooms. Hearing his subordinates being humiliated, the capital government's magistrate was not angry at all. Instead, he was secretly happy, and he shouted, "How dare these nobles be so presumptuous? How dare they harbor a criminal?" He made up his mind. Tomorrow, he would report this matter to the Fan Manor and see how they would answer for it. Fan Xian looked on coldly, but he was not in a hurry. With Lady Lu at home, he knew what his aunt was capable of. How could he have handled this matter without thinking it through? Furthermore, Mr. Yen Binghe was very trustworthy when it came to scheming. Back in the day, he had the entire northern Qi kingdom in the palm of his hand, so there was no way he would be able to handle a criminal case like this. As expected, The crowd outside the manor parted, and a few people walked in. The one leading them was Fan Xian's partner on his first visit to the capital government. It was Mr. Zheng, an official of the Fan Manor, and a famous scribe of the capital government. Mr. Zheng was famous, and so he did not need to kneel. He simply bowed to the magistrate and said, "Sir, what you say is absurd. Everyone in the capital knows that the Fan Manor has always been strict and fair. There is no such thing as harboring a criminal. As for what the second young master has done, you will have to investigate it in detail. The Fan Manor will not be biased." The magistrate of the capital government, Tian Jingmu, knew that the official in front of him was a famous scribe in the capital, and the lawyer next to him, Song Shuren, was even more famous for being a troublesome litigator. For the Fan family to put on such a show, they must be prepared to go the open route. His face darkened, and he shouted, "If you are not biased, then why don't you bring the criminal in?" In the cold autumn weather, Song Shuren waved his fan and laughed. "Capturing criminals is the business of the capital government. Since when did it become someone else's business?" Tian Jingmu laughed coldly. "Your second young master has committed a crime, so of course he must hand over the criminal. If he does not hand over the criminal, then is that not harboring a criminal? It is written clearly in the law of the Qin kingdom. Song Shuren, you should shut up." Song Shuren did not listen, and laughed. The law of the Qin kingdom states clearly that the criminal must first hand over the criminal, but sir, the second young master of the Fan family disappeared 8 days ago. Where are we supposed to find him? Tian Jingmu was so angry that he laughed. "Ha ha ha ha, what a ridiculous excuse." Song Shuren looked distressed. "Let the magistrate know that this is not an excuse. A few days ago, the Fan family reported to the capital government that the second young master had done many illegal things, but you did not pay any attention to them. At the time, they also said that the second young master had fled to escape punishment, and asked the capital government to quickly send bailiffs to arrest him." He waved his paper fan again, and said in a pained voice, "Minister Fan and Sir Fan Jr. would not hesitate to put justice before family. How could they be harboring a criminal?" Tian Jingmu slammed his gavel, and couldn't help but curse. "When did the Fan family report to us? And when did they report Fan Xija missing? How come I didn't know about this? Don't even think about muddying the waters and getting out of this mess. Whether or not there was, please look into the case file, and you will know." Song Shuren put on a fake smile, and cupped his hands in salute. Tian Jingmu's heart froze, and he immediately came to his senses. He did not call for the bailiffs to examine the case file on the spot. Instead, he found an excuse to leave the court. He and the advisor went to the study, and carefully looked over the case file from the past few days. When he saw the case file, which clearly stated that the second young master of the Fan family had fled to escape punishment, the capital magistrate almost fainted from anger. There was no such thing, so how could there be such a file? The capital government was heavily guarded. Even if the Overwatch Council were to make a move, it would be difficult not to alert anyone. How could the Fan family have such power? To be able to play such a trick without anyone knowing? Tian Jingmu's face was extremely ugly. He knew that there was a traitor in the capital government, but he could not immediately tell whether it was the magistrate or the official registrar who had done this. When Tian Jingmu returned to the court, he was no longer as stubborn as he had been at the beginning. After all, the case file was here, and during the examination, both the magistrate and the official registrar were beside him. Even if he was willing to risk destroying the Fan family's case file, there was no way he could hide it. This way, even if Fan Xija was found guilty, the Fan family had already made the first contribution. The Fan family's second young master had fled to escape punishment, and the Fan family did not purposely hide it. If this continued, how could the Fan family be dragged into this mess? In the end, the emperor would charge the Fan family with lax governance, and cut their titles and salaries. It would be impossible to achieve the results that the second prince had requested. The capital magistrate had a headache, but he was not willing to give up. With a dark face, he continued to fight with the Fan family's large team of litigation masters. The capital government temporarily retreated from the court. Fan Xian knew that they had done enough on the surface. From now on, Fan Xizha would become someone who fled to escape punishment. When Fan Xian was truly in power, he would find a way to clear his name, and the Fan family would finally be able to escape. As for the owner of the Baoyu house, Shi Chanli, because he had taken over after the incident, no matter how unreasonable the capital government was, they would not be able to bring him to justice. Fan Xian could not help but laugh. He even talked about the case with a man who was standing next to him. The families of the victims were being led by the bailiffs to a place behind the government to rest. His lips curled up, and he said goodbye to the man and followed them. His eyes glanced at the corner of the street, and under the eaves, there was a man who looked like a scholar. The families of the prostitutes were making their way to the corner of the street, and just as they were about to disappear from the sight of the onlookers, 4 or 5 masked men came out of nowhere. In their hands were shining knives, and these masked assassins danced wildly. Their attacks were ruthless, and they cut down on the bodies of the victims. The streets were filled with cries and wails. The people who were watching the show also shouted and fled in all directions. Fan Xian stood under a large locust tree and squinted as he watched the scene unfold. He was not worried, and in fact, he underestimated the power of the second prince. They were using the same tactic, and their actions were very clumsy. Last time, they succeeded in framing the prime minister because the emperor wanted them dead. The emperor did not want to kill them all, and now they were doing the same thing on the street. Were they not afraid that the emperor would laugh at them for being so simplistic? As for the lives of the victims, Fan Xian was not worried about them. Sure enough, a group of passers-by appeared out of nowhere at the end of the street and directly mixed into the battle. They quickly hid the victims of the murder behind them and faced the killers. Passers-by again, Fan Xian's favorite passers-by. The passers-by were not wielding knives, but were instead wielding spikes specially prepared by the Overwatch Council. With a few moves, they broke through the blades of the assassins and closed in. Their attacks were clean and efficient, and their style was simple and powerful. They seemed to have traces of Sir Wu Zhu. Fan Xian raised his eyebrows. He knew that this was because the true leader of the 6th Bureau, the Shadow, was Wu Zhu's admirer. The assassins sent by the second prince were actually quite skilled, but compared to the people of the 6th Bureau, their attacks were somewhat redundant. After a short fight, they were utterly defeated. These people instinctively wanted to escape, but the passers-by were like maggots on bones. There was nothing they could do. Clang! Clang! This sudden ambush and counterambush came to an abrupt end. The masked assassins fell miserably on the street, their bodies covered with a few miserable wounds, blood flowing everywhere. Fan Xian looked over and nodded. He was very satisfied with Yan Xiaoyan's arrangements. It did not matter if they were left alive, but they could not let these people escape under the watchful eyes of the public. Presumably, these assassins had the Overwatch Council's secret mark on them, so that they could frame Fan Xian. The result of this ambush was also within his expectations. The assassins raised by the princes could only be considered part-time assassins. When faced with the professionals of the 6th Bureau, they would naturally lose miserably. At this moment, something strange happened. In the corner of the street, the scholar who was hiding from the rain under the eaves suddenly floated out and entered the fray. He drew his sword, and with a free will, the light of the sword carried a pure zhenqi. The zhenqi on the sword was pure and violent, and it caused the puddles on the street to rise into the air. It transformed into a water arrow, and went straight for one of the victims. What a powerful sword aura! It came from the hands of such a weak scholar. The swordsmen of the 6th Bureau, who were disguised as passers-by, could not react in time. They did not dare to fight against the white mist that mixed with the rain sword. They dodged to the side, and the sharp needles shot out from their elbows in an attempt to slow down this skilled swordsman's sword. With several chi-chi sounds, the spike only pierced through the lower hem of the scholar's robe and brought down a few strands of cloth. It was completely unable to block the might of his sword. With a piu sound, the unadorned sword had already pierced into the body of one of the victims. Xie Bian, the most arrogant of the 8 generals of the second prince. He once said that he could defeat Fan Xian with one strike of the sword. He was the Xie Bian who killed Fan Xian. Fan Xian recognized the scholar who was hiding from the rain under the eaves at first glance. But he did not expect that, with his status and power, he would be so shameless as to attack the victim's family. Everything was set in stone. Even if Xie Bian killed the victim's family, so what? Fan Xian thought Xie Bian was only here to monitor the situation. He did not expect Xie Bian to throw away his pride and attack. So, his reaction was a little slow. The moment Xie Bian drew his sword, he knew that since the 6th Bureau was there, his plan to frame him had failed. Although he was arrogant, he didn't have the confidence that he could kill all the swordsmen of the 6th Bureau in broad daylight on the streets of Jingdo. They lived in the shadows all year round. However, he still had to draw his sword because he couldn't accept it. He watched helplessly as his subordinates were stabbed by those passers-by, while the victims he wanted to kill, although terrified, were unharmed. This kind of complete failure made him angry, so he chose to draw his sword irrationally and violently. Killing the victim's family was a good thing. At least it could save the second prince some face in his fight against Fan Xian. Plus, if even one of these prostitutes' family died, Fan Xian would have to spend a lot of time and energy explaining what had happened. His right hand, which was holding the hilt of his sword, felt a familiar vibration. He knew that the tip of his sword had once again pierced into a stranger's body. He was going to take away another innocent soul. He was satisfied, and he laughed arrogantly. He pulled his sword back and watched the victim's chest bleed. And then, his smile immediately froze. Xie Bian was confident that his sword would not miss, and it did indeed pierce into the victim's body. The only strange thing was that the tip of the sword was a few inches away from the middle of the body. It was this distance that prevented his sword from killing the victim. And he had already lost his second chance to draw his sword. The victim in front of him was like a kite. He was miserably slanted, but he quickly flew to the right. He did not know what kind of power could pull a person in a direction that defied the laws of physics. Xie Bian unconsciously twisted his wrist and brought his sword up in front of his chest. He suddenly turned his head, but he only had time to see Fan Xian, who had just rushed over, retract his foot. Fan Xian. As a brilliant swordsman, he immediately sensed his opponent's aura. Amidst his sharp cry, he gathered all the power in his sword and pierced straight and unstoppable toward Fan Xian's face. At that moment, the passers-by of the 6th Bureau knew that Fan Xian had arrived. They protected the victim, who was still in shock, and retreated to a safe place. Fan Xian's kick had saved the victim's life, and he had no time to pull out his dagger. He looked at the cold light coming towards him, and he felt the cold air of the sword. He felt as if his eyelashes were going to fall off. Xie Bian raised his hand. Chi chi chi, 3 consecutive sounds rang out. 3 crossbow bolts were dipped in antivirus poison. They flew against the wind of the sword and quickly flew towards Xie Bian's face. The tip of the sword was pointed at Xie Bian's face, and the crossbow bolts were also aimed at his face. The two of them clearly had no interest in competing in the thickest of skin. Fan Xian was silent, and he coldly twisted his body. He used his strong control of his body, and the cold sword brushed past his face. He punched Xie Bian's chest. The punch was full of zhenqi, and it broke through the air like thunder. If it hit, Xie Bian's organs would be crushed. Xie Baiyan waved his left sleeve as if his life depended on it. A cloud appeared, and it brushed away the two small crossbows. He wanted to take Fan Xian's life with his sword, but he didn't expect Fan Xian to take such a risk and throw out his terrifying fist. He screamed and cut his wrist. His left hand turned into a palm, and he slapped Fan Xian's fist. There was a crisp crack, and Xie Baiyan's wrist was broken. Fan Xian! Xie Baiyan shouted angrily. It wasn't because he was afraid of Fan Xian's jinqi, but because when the fist and the palm collided, a faint yellow smoke exploded from between the two. Xie Baiyan didn't expect Fan Xian to use such a despicable method, even when he had the upper hand. At this moment, the poisonous smoke had entered his body, and his sword power had been exhausted. He was powerless to cut horizontally, and he was in a rush to meet Fan Xian's strange and tyrannical fist. He was wide open, and the last of the 3 arrows pierced into his shoulder. He was poisoned again. Fan Xian! Xie Baiyan cursed Fan Xian's name for the 3rd time. He knew he had underestimated Fan Xian's power. He forced the jinqi in his body to swing his sword to the west, aiming for Fan Xian's throat. It was a vicious attack. Xie Baiyan's body floated up into the air, ready to jump onto the roof of a house. He wanted to escape from this powerful, yet treacherous master. But how could Fan Xian let him escape? A gray shadow flashed by, and Fan Xian was already in midair. He had Xie Baiyan's body entangled. He extended his right arm and chopped down on Xie Baiyan's ankle. This palm knife was a small trick of the coffin breaker. Although it was attacking a corner that Xie Baiyan didn't care about, it still did a lot of damage. Xie Baiyan grunted. He felt as if his ankle had been crushed. An unbearable pain spread through half of his body, and it slowed his speed of escape. In that moment, Fan Xian silently made his move. He didn't know how many times he had attacked Xie Baiyan. The two of them stood on the drizzling street again. They became 2 blurry shadows. One was gray and the other was black. They tangled together. There was a series of muffled sounds. Xie Baiyan's body was hit countless times by Fan Xian. Fan Xian had attacked too quickly, and so his jinqi hadn't been used. Xie Baiyan had used his decades of training to withstand the blows, but the tip of Fan Xian's sword was like the wind. It couldn't even touch Fan Xian's body. This reality made Xie Baiyan feel hopeless. How could Fan Xian be so fast? Xie Baiyan screamed. He shook his wrist, and his sword became a silver rain to protect his body. Finally, Fan Xian was forced to take a few steps back. There was a thud. Xie Baiyan's trembling right hand was propped up against the ground. The tip of the sword was stabbed into the puddles of water. It trembled, and a few strange lines appeared on the surface of the water. Looking at Fan Xian, who looked calm, Xie Baiyan felt pain in his body. It was as if there were countless knives cutting through his veins. He knew that Fan Xian's attacks had damaged his internal organs, and the poison in his body was starting to take effect. His right leg was about to lose its balance. Facing his opponent, who looked calm, Xie Baiyan had lost the confidence to fight. 9. Xie Baiyan knew that even if he didn't underestimate Fan Xian, he was no match for Fan Xian. He now had a completely different opinion of Fan Xian's power. He thought about it, and after saying the word 9, the wounds in his body flared up again. He coughed up a few streaks of blood and swallowed the last word. He looked at Fan Xian, and his eyes flashed with confusion. He still remembered when he was in the tea shop outside of the Baoyue brothel. He had boasted that he, by himself, could defeat Fan Xian. That was built on his confidence in himself and his judgment of Fan Xian. Although this young man, whose surname was Fan, had killed Qing Jushu on Yulan Street last year, Xie Baiyan did not believe that the son of an influential family could have the willpower to truly devote himself to the path of martial arts. He did not believe that he could possess such exquisite and practical killing skills. But who would have thought that such a rich young man had already entered the 9th level? 9th level. Xie Bian coughed, but he still managed to squeeze out those two words. His right thumb moved slightly, and he pressed it against the hilt of his sword. Fan Xian's feet touched the ground, and his entire body shot towards Xie Bian like an arrow. A black light flashed, and he used his best dagger to cut through the sword Xie Bian had used to kill himself. At the same time, he mercilessly punched Xie Bian's temple. Then, like a wisp of smoke, he retreated. It was as if he had never attacked. Xie Bian fainted on the street in the dirty rainwater. His body was covered in wounds, and the water splashed everywhere. Fan Xian would not give a loser a chance to express his feelings or pose for a moment before he died. Finally, the bailiffs of the capital government arrived. The capital government magistrate heard the news, and he pretended to be surprised. Seeing the situation, his heart froze. He knew that the second prince's plan had been foiled. Looking at Fan Xian, who was smiling, Tian Jingmu did not know what to feel. Someone wanted to kill me. I happened to come to the capital government to listen to my brother's case, and I happened to run into them. Fan Xian's face was calm as he spoke, but his right hand was still trembling. Fortunately, I had a few capable subordinates with me. Otherwise, these people would not have succeeded. Xie Bian, who had acted on his own, had not succeeded in killing himself. For Fan Xian, being able to obtain one of the 8 generals was a pleasant surprise. The 8 generals of the second prince's manor were not a secret in the capital. Today, so many people saw Xie Bian assassinate the victim of the murder case. It was a great opportunity for the 8th Bureau to spread rumors. Fan Xian wanted to say thank you to Xie Bian, who was lying on the ground. The capital government bailiffs took over the watch, and there was nothing else for Fan Xian to do. He did not need to reveal Xie Bian's identity, as his subordinates would take care of it. I will hand this man over to you, sir. Fan Xian looked at the capital government magistrate with a smile that was not a smile. This man is evil. Please watch him carefully, sir. Fan Xian had no intention of taking Xie Bian back to the Overwatch Council. Even if he found out that the murder of the victim was ordered by the second prince, if it was the Overwatch Council that found out, it would be much weaker. He handed the unconscious Xie Bian over to the capital government. He had a dark plan in mind as well. Xie Bian was handed over alive. If he died in the future, things would become very interesting. The capital government magistrate was a third-rank official, and the Overwatch Council could not investigate him without permission. It was a rare opportunity for Fan Xian to kill him. How could Fan Xian miss it? If he missed it, even Yan Bingyun would scold him for being soft-hearted. In the capital, people had not yet recovered from the shock of what happened. Without a doubt, what happened outside the capital government would become a topic of conversation. In the eyes of the nobles who knew what was going on, the battle between the second prince and Fan Xian was tipping the scales of victory in favor of the second prince. That is, if the emperor did not object, and the palace remained silent. His subordinates, who were disguised as passers-by, guarded Fan Xian as they walked into the manor. One of them saw Fan Xian's trembling right hand, and thought he had been injured in the fight. Fan Xian smiled and said, "It's nothing. I'm just a little excited. It's been a few months since I've enjoyed something like this." This was the truth. The fight with Xie Bian had made Fan Xian excited. He seemed to enjoy this sort of work. Sometimes, he even thought that perhaps Yan Bingyun was more suited to be the head of the Overwatch Council, and that he was more suited to work for Yan Bingyun. However, the trembling of his right hand was not only due to excitement. Fan Xian gently rubbed his wrist. His originally sunny mood suddenly had an additional trace of haze. Chapter 300. During this period of time, the Overwatch Council, under the guidance of Commissioner Fan and Yan Bingyun Jr., had armed themselves to the teeth. They did not hesitate to tear into the second prince's faction, from officials to economic interests. with the Baoyu brothel incident as the catalyst, and with the assassination attempt outside the capital government as the root cause, they attacked the royal court and the Dasuo Trading Company. They dug into the deepest recesses of the other party's soul, and with a flash of crafty thought, they pressed forward. First of all, it was no surprise that one of the 8 generals, Xie Baiyan, had suddenly died in the capital's prison. This gave the Overwatch Council a good excuse. The Overwatch Council sent 3 memorials to the palace, and finally, Tian Jingmu was suspended from his duties for further investigation. The stupid move that the second prince had made in order to protect himself had caused the council to link up with one another and directly remove the second prince's greatest support in the capital. On the other hand, Yan Bingyun had begun to use other methods to successfully control the supply routes from Xinjiang to the capital. He had forced the Cui family into a state of panic, and no one knew how much money they had lost. They had no choice but to use the funds of the Jiangnan family in order to forcefully reopen the route to the north, which had been cut off by Shenzhong's death. The second prince's money began to shrink. The public opinion was not in favor of the second prince's faction. Although there were experts in the palace, they were not as effective and professional as the Overwatch Council. Compared to the propagandists of the 8th Bureau, the workers sent by the palace to the tea-houses and taverns did not have the power to sway the hearts of the people. Although the Overwatch Council was ruthless, the people of the capital were still on the side of the Fan family. They felt that the missing second master of the Fan family had become a scapegoat for the second prince, which was why Fan Xian Jr. was so ruthless. As for Hongqing, poor Crown Prince Jing, his reputation was even worse. Who told him to have an affair with Yuan Meng? Everyone in the capital knew that next spring, Li Hongqing was going to marry the eldest daughter of the Fan family. But you ordered Fan Xizha, who was only 14 years old, to open a brothel, and made him take the blame for the murder of a prostitute. Motherf *Ker, how could there be a brother-in-law in this world who would use his brother-in-law so shamelessly? For a period of time, the second prince's faction was beaten back step by step, be it in the officialdom or in other aspects. Their morale was low, and they had no strength to fight back. The only counterattack they attempted was the imperial censorate, which was under the control of the eldest princess. But the imperial censorate wasted their efforts. All of the actions of the Overwatch Council were carried out according to the laws of the Qing Kingdom, and there was not a single place where they could be used against them. As for the assassination of the 3 witnesses of the Baoyue brothel murder case, it was a headless murder case. Even if someone guessed that it was the Overwatch Council who did it, there was no evidence. The Overwatch Council's attitude toward the assassination was simple and clear. The 3 men had been personally sent by Commissioner Fan's family to the Yamen of the capital government. How could they have died outside the capital government? If there was a problem, the biggest problem would be Tian Jingmu, who was on good terms with the second prince. Fan Xian was very satisfied with the results of the battle so far. In any case, the bottom line of the palace was there, and he could not directly chase the second prince out of the capital. As long as he could weaken the second prince to the point where he could no longer threaten him, beat him until he was in unspeakable pain, and vent the anger of the Fan family, that was enough. Up until now, the terrifying power of the Overwatch Council had only been revealed to the public. The reason why this operation was able to go so smoothly was because Chen Pingping had used the transfer order to give all of the authority to Fan Xian. More importantly, Fan Xian's operation had been planned since he was in Shangjing, northern Qi. From summer to autumn, he and Yan Bingyun had been preparing for this for a long time. At the time, the memorials that were presented to the imperial censorate had mentioned the relationship between the second prince and the eldest princess. But last time the emperor had not released it. This time, because of the Baoyue brothel incident, Fan Xian had used his anger to bring this matter forward. If the Overwatch Council still could not win this battle, Chen Pingping would probably jump out of his wheelchair in anger and yell at these little bastards for ruining the reputation of the Overwatch Council. The palace remained eerily quiet. All the nobles, including the second prince's mother, imperial concubine Shu, the crown prince of the Eastern Palace, and the empress, seemed to be deaf and blind. They were cautious and did not express any opinions. Everyone knew that this was to see the emperor's attitude. What was the emperor doing? News had come out of the palace. The emperor had invited Jiangnan's Daoist troupe into the palace to perform in a play. At this time, there was a storm in Jingdo, but the emperor of the Qing kingdom still had spare time to accompany the empress dowager and watch a play for a day. Who knew how many baskets of copper coins he had given out? He was indescribably happy and relaxed. Now, everyone finally saw the situation clearly. It seemed that the emperor did not think this kind of small matter was worth watching. He did not even bother to lift his eyelids. How could the small fights of young people in the capital compare to the plays performed by famous troupes in Jiangnan? The situation was now clear. The court officials, who had maintained a neutral stance, used their sharp minds and suddenly discovered a reality. Fan Xian's emperor's favor had reached a shocking level. Who was Fan Xian's opponent? It was the second prince, the emperor's own son. His Majesty could actually be so impartial. What kind of favor was this? These people did not dare to offend the second prince, so they could only stand even more firmly on the wall. They stuck their feet in the mud and stubbornly practiced the grassroots spirit. They swayed left and right, but they were not willing to casually lean to any side. This reality made the second prince suck in a breath of cold air. He knew that these years, he had quietly developed his power in the court. He could not help but think, could it be that after Fan Xian returned to the capital, Fan Xian had secretly received instructions from the palace to target him? However, the second prince was also a sinister person. He knew that the current situation did not allow him to retreat. Even if he was willing to put aside his pride as a prince and hope to shake hands with Fan Xian a second time, Fan Xian might not be in the mood to do so. Furthermore, the emperor's warm attitude made the second prince know that if he could not defeat Fan Xian, then he could only wait for Fan Xian to knock him down to the ground, just as they had said in the tea shop. Under this strong pressure, the second prince once again reluctantly made his move. The imperial censorate once again impeached Fan Xian. This time, the charges were very real and the evidence was very solid. In short, it had nothing to do with what Fan Xizha had done, and it also involved the Minister of Revenue, Fan Jian. The snow-like memorials were sent to the provinces, completely skipping over the Ministry of Justice and the Supreme Court. They directly asked the Fan father and son to step down and apologize. It was a battle to the death. On this day, dozens of remonstrants put on an even grander display than the last time they had impeached Fan Xian. They knelt straight in front of the palace gate. There was no rain today, and on the greenish-gray square in front of the palace, dozens of red official robes fluttering in the autumn wind were particularly eye-catching. The court elders who came and went from the palace gate could not help but shake their heads and hide behind a corner door, not daring to interfere. According to the laws of the Qing kingdom, officials who were impeached were required to explain themselves. For this impeachment, the Fan father and son had to personally go to the palace to apologize to the emperor and then explain themselves in court. But in court, the second prince's faction was still very powerful, and the debate in front of the palace was not easy for the Fan father and son to pass. The censors of the imperial censorate were full of confidence. They were waiting for Fan Jian and Fan Xian, two of the most corrupt officials in the Qing kingdom, to be taken down by them. This time was different from last time. This time, with the help of the second prince, they were able to obtain concrete evidence. It was enough to prove that the Fan family, and even the Lu family's Zhongyi manor, were connected to the infamous Baoyu brothel. They knelt on the ground and excitedly waited for Fan Xian's arrival. Even if the Fan family had sent Fan Sija away and gotten rid of the Baoyu brothel, and even if the emperor had shown mercy, the evidence was still there. The Fan family would have to pay the price. They were waiting for the arrogant commissioner of the Overwatch Council to appear in front of them and admit his mistakes, apologize, and bow his head. It was not just the Imperial Censorate's censors. Many people were prepared to see how the Fan Manor, or the Overwatch Council, would react in the face of such an aggressive impeachment. Every official wanted to keep their face, and to be bitten by the Imperial Censorate like this was a very embarrassing thing to do. Everyone knew that Fan Xian was a person who placed great importance on his reputation, so the officials were even more interested. Even Xu Wu the scholar was waiting to see Fan Xian's wretched appearance with a heart full of mischief, revenge, or ridicule. But no one expected that when the emperor summoned Fan Xian, he would not come. Not only did he not come, but Minister Fan did not come either. This pair of father and son had a tacit understanding, and shamelessly used the same trick: escape while sick. Hearing this news, the second prince was shocked. He did not expect the Fan family to not only be like a hungry wolf when it came to profit, but when it came to the issue of face, they were also ruthless. They did not even give the second prince a chance to win back some face. Ruthless, this father and son were ruthless. Xu Wu, the scholar, was old and used to hiding in the meeting room outside the corner door and drinking tea. After hearing this news, he spat out a mouthful of tea. He had gone to the Imperial College to play a few games of chess with Fan Xian. Fan Xian had promised to play, but now he had caused such a commotion in the capital. He even said he did not want to eat the pieces. Xu Wu the scholar was so angry at Fan Xian, who was outwardly respectful but had a belly full of evil trick. He had hoped to see Fan Xian suffer a setback at the court conference, but he did not expect the kid to say he was sick and not come. This made the old scholar, who had been watching a show, unable to vent his anger. He was very unhappy. The news of the Fan father and son claiming illness reached the palace. The emperor, who was reading the memorials from the counties, was also shocked. He furrowed his brows and did not say anything. The concubines in the rear palace also knew of this matter. They laughed and scolded that this child of the Fan family was a troublemaker. He did not know how to make the emperor less annoyed. They also did not know how Yi Chern had married such a husband. At first, he had seemed full of poetry. Now, he was a disgruntled scoundrel. The ones who were most disappointed were the Imperial Censorate kneeling outside the palace gate. Since the other party claimed illness and did not come, no matter how murderous they were, there was no point of resistance. Their hearts were empty, and they felt very uncomfortable. They left dejectedly. Even the brown official robes they wore hung weakly around their bodies. They could not be bothered with the teasing of the autumn wind. People grew up eating grains and were not invincible. How could they not be sick? But for the Fan father and son to fall sick so coincidentally, and for the illness to come so suddenly that they could not get out of bed, it was a bit too strange. Especially since Fan Xian was the direct disciple of Fei Jie of the Overwatch Council. Although he did not practice medicine, even the royal doctors in the palace knew of his methods. How could he suddenly fall sick? Not only did the officials in court not believe it, but the people of Jingdo did not believe it. In fact, even the ladies in the palace and the emperor on the dragon chair did not believe it. So after the court meeting ended, the palace guards led the royal doctors, led by Eunuch Hong, who rarely left the palace, in a grandiose manner to Fan Manor. They sent an edict to express their condolences, and at the same time, to see what illness the father and son had. Many of the manor's spies followed this procession. Because everyone thought the Fan father and son were pretending to be sick, they unconsciously thought that in order not to go to court and make a fool of themselves, they had offended the emperor. It was a small crime of deceiving the emperor. It was extremely stupid and extremely arrogant. The second prince also did not understand this matter. He was a prince and had grown up in the palace. Of course, he knew Eunuch Hong's methods. No trick of pretending to be sick could be hidden from the sickly old eunuch. Fan Xian really was sick. This news was confirmed by Eunuch Hong. The emperor had no follow-up measures to prove it. It spread to every corner of the capital. No one suspected that Fan Xian was pretending to be sick. Although Minister Fan had only occasionally caught a cold, Fan Xian really was bedridden. His body was very weak. At the critical moment of the Overwatch Council and the Second Prince's battle, Fan Xian had unfortunately fallen ill. This reality made many people feel a very strange emotion. Would the situation in Jingdou change because of this? After all, a similar situation had occurred in history before. When the Northern Wei Kingdom's emperor was investigating the illustrious Zhan family, the reason he was able to succeed was because the famous General Zhan Qinfeng, had diarrhea for 3 days. Although history was ridiculous, it was very real. Don't worry about anything. Fan Xian frowned. He looked at Mu Tai, who was sitting in front of his bed, and said, "Just listen to Master Yan's arrangements." After returning from the capital government, he had fallen ill. Although it was not serious, after the battle with Xie Bian, he began to lose control of his jinqi. It was running around in his body, forcing him to spend more time meditating. His pale complexion and strange pulse had successfully fooled the mysterious eunuch Hong. Chapter 301. In the second half of the autumn night, the moon had gone down, and the sun had not yet risen. There was only a dark blue sky. There was a violent coughing in the back of Fan Manor. The coughing did not stop, and it did not stop for a long time. It startled the servants, and they struggled to wake up from their dreams. There was a flurry of activity in the garden. Perhaps it was a problem with the weather, but not only had Minister Fan caught a cold, but some of the servants had also caught a cold. Those with runny noses had been sent to the country estates outside the capital, but the rest of the people did not dare to be careless. They drank the medicine the young master had written every day. The medicine was very effective, and the cold did not spread. The reason why the coughing made the people of Fan Manor panic was because it came from the young master's room. The young master had been suffering from a strange illness for the past 2 days. He had coughed badly, but he did not want the palace doctors to prescribe medicine. He believed in his own method. But after a few days, the coughing had not subsided. The servants of Fan Manor could not help but worry, afraid that something had happened to the young master, who had been very kind to them. The head maid, Cece, had a red ribbon tied around her forehead and combed her slightly messy hair. She stood angrily in the small kitchen. As she smelled the strong smell of medicine coming from the room, she called out to the girls who did the hard work, telling them to work faster. She was someone sent to the capital by the ancestors of Danzhou, and her future status was obvious. So in Fan Manor, her words carried some weight. The sleepy servants knew that the young master's illness was troublesome. Seeing her angry, they bit their lips and did not dare to respond. After watching for a while, Cece still could not relax. She moved a small stool and sat in front of the medicine stove. She held a fan in her hand and gently waved it. She stared unblinkingly at the mouth of the stove, where the medicinal mist was rising. Her eyes gradually turned red, and she did not dare to be careless. Brewing medicine was very particular about the heat. The medicine in front of her was for the young master to take. If she did not watch, she would not feel at ease. In the bedroom, Lin Wanner was wearing a cotton robe embroidered on the outside. She rubbed Fan Xian's chest, feeling sorry for him. Carefully, she asked, "How about we really try the royal doctor's prescription?" Fan Xian coughed until his face was red. He waved his hand and forced a smile. "How could I be so precious? Besides, I know my own body. I won't die. Just prescribe some medicine for myself." Lin Wan also knew that her husband's medical skills were exceptional, otherwise he wouldn't have been able to cure the lung disease that had haunted her for 15 years. But these past few days she had heard him coughing violently, so she couldn't help but feel worried. Biting her lip, she said, "Even Eunuch Hong can't tell the cause of this illness, but you say you know you." She rolled her eyes and said, "Should I write a letter to Mr. Fei and ask?" Fan Xian coughed again. He knew that his wife was still worried. He sighed and said, "It's not like you don't know that teacher of mine. Out of every year, he spends most of the year wandering around. Even if he wanted to rush back, who knows how long it would take." He then smiled and said, "Maybe 3 or 4 months. By that time, I'm afraid I'll already be a dead man." "You?" He gently flicked the tip of Wanner's nose and jokingly said, "Then you'll be the prettiest widow in the capital." Lin Wana spat on the ground a few times and angrily said, "What time is it, and you still say such nonsense?" Fan Xian laughed. He wasn't as nervous as the rest of the family, because he knew exactly what had happened to his body. The medicine he was brewing right now was only to help him calm his heart and clear his mind, relax his lungs, clear his meridians, and stabilize his condition. As for the real cause of the illness, he would have to rely on himself to fix it. As he spoke, he comforted Wanner a bit, and then carefully placed his right hand under the blanket. His right hand would occasionally tremble. It had started outside the capital government, and it hadn't gotten any better until today. There was a knock on the door, and Cece carefully carried the medicine into the room. The servant girl, Siki, who slept with her in the front room, had long since climbed out of bed. She lit the oil lamp on the table, moved a high table, and placed it in front of the bed of the young master and mistress. She took the bowl of medicine, took out a spoon, and gently stirred the medicine in the bowl to cool it down. When the temperature was just right, she fed Fan Xian a small sip. Fan Xian drank it, and it tasted a little bitter. He unconsciously licked his lips, but Cece had already stuffed a sugar pill into his mouth, and immediately diluted the bitterness in his mouth. He couldn't help but laugh. "I'm a man, do you really need to serve me like this?" Cece smiled and said, "Young master, when you were little, you were afraid of taking medicine." Fan Xian thought to himself, the medicine in this world can't be coated with sugar, so of course he would frown when he drank it. Siki took out a silk handkerchief from her sleeve and helped Fan Xian wipe the corner of his mouth. She also said very seriously, "Young master, you are now a patient. You can't force yourself." Seeing the two servant girls like this, even Wan couldn't stand it anymore. She laughed and scolded them, "Don't spoil him too much." Although she said this, her small hands kept moving down Fan Xian's back, making him feel more comfortable. Although Fan Xian enjoyed the life of a young master, and felt that it was a good thing to be so comfortable when sick, he couldn't help but shake his head. He reached for the bowl of medicine and drank it in one gulp. He wiped his mouth with his sleeve and smiled. "I'm a part-time doctor, not a child." The two servant girls looked at each other and smiled. They didn't say anything. Seeing that it was getting late, Fan Xian knew that his coughing had kept the servant girls busy for a while. He couldn't help but feel a little guilty. He said, "After you drink the medicine, you shouldn't be coughing anymore. Go to sleep. Let the servant girls who are on night watch go to sleep as well. The autumn night is cold, what if they get sick again? It's going to be dawn soon. Why are you still sleeping? It's always better to sleep a little longer," Fan Xian said seriously. They knew that this young master cared for his servants, and that under his gentle appearance was a heart that never went back on his word. Cece and Siki didn't dare to argue. They agreed in unison and went out to arrange the chores. Fan Xian got out of bed and poured a cup of tea to rinse his mouth. Wan saw this and couldn't help but say, "Drinking cold tea when you're sick isn't good for your body." Fan Xian smiled and sat back on the bed. "I told you, this illness is different from other illnesses. The couple talked for a while. Wan saw that he wasn't coughing anymore, and she felt a little more at ease. She felt sleepy, but seeing that he didn't want to sleep, she didn't either. Finally, Fan Xian couldn't stand it anymore. He quietly reached out and rubbed her shoulders. His fingers brushed over a few of the calming acupuncture points on her head. Only then did she fall asleep. Looking at his sleeping wife, Fan Xian knew that she had been worried about him these past few days. She was mentally and physically exhausted. He couldn't help but shake his head. His illness wasn't something that could be cured just by taking good care of himself. It wasn't like his father's. Minister Fan's cold, under his skillful hands, was already showing signs of improvement. In about 2 more days, he would be completely cured. However, his father was old, and his body wasn't like a young man's. His recovery was always slower. He gently waved his hand and extinguished the oil lamp on the table 5 feet away. The entire bedroom sank into darkness, but he kept his bright eyes open. He still couldn't fall asleep, because he had been sitting quietly for too long these past few days. It was not easy for him to get sleepy. The tip of his tongue gently licked the dregs of the medicine between his teeth, evaluating the herbs he had personally chosen. He seemed to be able to feel the active ingredients in the herbs enter his lungs and begin to help him soothe the discomfort. He felt a little proud of himself. He reached out and pulled the blanket over his wife's body. Then he put his hand into a secret compartment under his pillow and pulled out a small medicine pouch. Inside the pouch were several large pills that were perfectly round and rough to the touch. Although the room was dark, Fan Xian knew that these pills were red. Ever since he was young, Mr. Fei Jie had ordered him to carry these pills with him at all times, just in case something went wrong with the nameless martial secrets he was practicing. If that overbearing and ruthless Xinqi was about to break through his meridians, this pill would be his last resort. When Fan Xian was very young, when he was still living in Danzhou, Fei Jie had discovered this fatal problem. The nameless martial secrets that Wu Zhu had left for Fan Xian, or rather, for Fan Xian's mother, could indeed be cultivated into an overbearing and vigorous Xinqi. The problem was that this kind of Xinqi was too overbearing and ruthless. If an ordinary person were to practice it, they would not be able to practice for long before the Xinqi in their body would burst and pierce through them. Once their meridians were broken, they would naturally become useless. But compared to the people of this world, there was something strange about Fan Xian. His meridians seemed to be much thicker than those of the people of this world. Because of this, he had been secretly practicing the nameless and tyrannical martial method since he was a baby. By the time he was 4 years old, the Xinqi in his body had already reached a shocking level, but he had not exploded and died. But Fei Jie had once said that as the Xinqi in his body grew stronger and stronger, there would come a day when the naturally formed meridian channels would no longer be able to contain it, and Fan Xian would have to suffer greatly. But after more than 10 years, Fan Xian did not feel this kind of danger. Although the Xinqi in his body was overbearing, it was still under his control. Especially after the age of 12, when he finished practicing the first volume of the nameless martial secrets, the storm-like Xinqi in his body suddenly stopped. It was completely tamed, and did not affect him in the slightest. So he gradually let down his guard, and even almost forgot about the matter. He no longer carried the pills with him at all times, but left them at home. Except when he went on a diplomatic mission to northern Qi, he had brought one with him, but he had not used it. Trouble always came when people were least prepared. After the seemingly safe but dangerous journey to northern Qi, the Xinqi in Fan Xian's body had finally merged with his skills. He had already broken through the threshold of the 9th level, and was beginning to reach the pinnacle of martial arts in the world. The overbearing Xinqi in his body had finally reached perfection, and he could even fight against Ku He's disciple, Lang Tiao. Unexpectedly, after he defeated Xie Baian, one of the 8 generals, Outside the capital government, the Zhenshi in his body began to act up. Starting from the snow mountain at the back of his waist, along the meridians, the two Zhenshi channels were like two circles, communicating with each other in his body. But now, the Zhenshi seemed to have smelled some traces of the owner of his body, and it began to become restless. It was no longer willing to stay in the meridians, and instead, it kept extending, probing, and piercing in all directions. Fan Xian's hands were where he had perfect control of the Zhenshi, but now they had become the juncture for the Zhenshi in his body to overflow. Now, his right hand would occasionally tremble. That was the result of the Zhenshi in his muscles and meridians not listening to him. The situation was not too serious. At least, it was still within his control. After these days of meditation, he had used his mind to suppress the overbearing Zhenshi in his body. But the two opposing forces had damaged his lungs, and that was why he could not stop coughing. But if he allowed this situation to continue, there would come a day when he would not be able to control the overbearing and violent Zhenshi in his body. Fan Xian had also tried to practice the second half of the nameless martial secret, but so far he had not made any progress. Sometimes, when he coughed badly, he hated Wu Zhu. "You gave me the absorbing stars, so you should at least give me a way to deal with it, right?" He gently squeezed the medicine pouch in his hand and frowned. A few days ago, he had analyzed the pill his teacher had left him. It was like a tiger fighting a lion. To help him deal with the overbearing Zhenshi in his body, his teacher had also given him a very overbearing medicine. He had no confidence in what would happen if he took the medicine. There was a lot of mayflower mixed in it, and that was an authentic medicine for dispersing Zhenshi. Was he willing to give up the Zhenshi that he had painstakingly cultivated for over 10 years? Even if he did not lose his Zhenshi, he feared that the Zhenshi in his body would be consumed by more than half. But if he did not take it, did he have to watch the Zhenshi explode into a giant ball of blood in a few months, or perhaps a few years? Even if it did not have such a terrifying effect, it did not look good to have his right hand constantly trembling. He was so young, and yet he had to act like someone with Parkinson's disease? To take it or not to take it, that was a big question. A rooster crowed in the distance, waking up the sun and driving away the night, but the people were still sleeping soundly. Fan Xian raised his head and realized that he had been sitting by the bed for an hour. He couldn't help but laugh at himself. He, who was most afraid of death, when faced with such a difficult situation, could also be so cowardly and hesitant. Perhaps this was also an opportunity, he comforted himself. Do not destroy the shape of the Hua pool, let the heavenly spring pour into my body. He slowly recited the incantation and sat by the bed, entering a meditative state. He carefully withdrew the chaotic Zhenshi in his body into his meridians, and then slowly returned it to the snow-capped mountain behind his waist, letting it shine brightly there, illuminating the snow-capped mountain. Suddenly, his heart jumped, and Fan Xian opened his eyes. He casually put on some clothes, pushed open the door, and walked to the most secluded corner of the garden. It was the little practice field where he had tested the poison needles. He didn't need to look around to see the strange uncle with a black cloth covering his face next to the fake mountain. He couldn't help but shake his head and sigh. He opened his mouth to complain, "So you still know to come back." Chapter 302. The sky was already bright, and the morning breeze was blowing in the courtyard, but it was still very dark. The person next to the rockery was dressed in coarse clothes, with an iron stake casually stuck in his waist. His face was covered with a piece of black cloth, but he seemed to be one with the surrounding scenery and buildings. He didn't make a sound, and even his presence seemed very faint. Even if a servant walked past him, they wouldn't be able to find him. Fan Xian looked at the man in front of him, who he had lived with day and night for 16 years. Thinking about how long it had been since they had last seen each other, he did not know what to feel. He wanted to beat him up, but he was sure that he would not be able to beat him. Should he throw himself at him and cry? Uncle Wu Zhu was not a person who liked to stir up emotions, so he could only shake his head and suppress the joy in his heart. He walked over, and found that Uncle Wu Zhu was holding a small knife in his hand. He was incessantly carving something. When he got closer, he realized that he was carving a piece of wood. Fortunately, it is not a carving of a woman, otherwise I would have thought that you had become the blind Tan Hua, that innocent Li Xuanhuan. The courtyard was silent. Fan Xian suppressed his laughter. Then I would vomit. Wu Zhu, surprisingly, nodded and said, Li Xuanhuan is indeed a very shameless person. It was Fan Xian's turn to be surprised. After a moment he said, You know Li Xuanhuan? Wu Zhu put the piece of wood and the knife back into his sleeve. He said coldly, The lady told me this story, and she hated this male lead the most. Fan Xian laughed. It seems that I am quite similar to my mother. A moment later, the two of them appeared in the most secretive of the 3 study rooms in Fan Manor. Although there were no traps around, without Fan Xian's permission, no one could approach this study. Even Minister Fan had tacitly agreed to this rule. Tell me, what have you been doing for the past 6 months? Without question, Fan Xian was very interested in Wu Zhu's disappearance. Although he had already confirmed his suspicions from the small piece of wood, such shocking gossip had to be heard from the mouth of the person in question. Only then would it be particularly exciting. At this moment, he seemed to have long forgotten the zhenqi running around in his body like a little mouse. He also forgot that he should first ask Uncle Wu how he could save his own life. Instead, he stared straight into Wu Zhu's eyes. He also poured himself a cup of last night's leftover tea. Naturally, Wu Zhu did not get any, because Wu Zhu did not drink tea. I went to the north. Wu Zhu thought for a moment, as if confirming his itinerary. Then, I went to the south. Fan Xian was used to his uncle's strange way of thinking, so he was not angry at the senseless answer. Instead, he patiently asked, What are you going to do in the north? Why are you going south? I'm going to the north to find Ku He, Wu Zhu said calmly. He did not think that many people would be scared to death if this matter were to spread. After a fight, I went to the south to find someone. Fan Xian chuckled. The Grandmaster Ku He had been injured. Naturally, it was the blind uncle in front of him who had played a good trick. Immediately, he thought of a problem and furrowed his brows in concern. Are you all right? Wu Zhu tilted his head slightly and looked at his left shoulder. I was injured here, but it's already healed. His words were simple and to the point, but Fan Xian could feel the danger. He had fought with Haitang, and could clearly feel the power of Haitang's bald teacher, one of the top 4 grandmasters in the world. It must have been terrifying. Although Wu Zhu was arrogant, it was inevitable that Fan Xian would have to pay a price for injuring him. As long as he was healed now, that was all that mattered. Why did you do it? Fan Xian frowned. Wu Zhu said, First of all, if he was in northern Qi, I thought it would be inconvenient for you. Fan Xian nodded. If Ku He had been in Shangjing when he went on the diplomatic mission, he would not have been able to toy with the armed forces of northern Qi and obtain so much useful information before Xiao En died. Wu Zhu continued, Second of all, I felt that I knew Ku He, so I wanted to ask him about what happened all those years ago. Fan Xian suddenly raised his head and looked at him in surprise. Suddenly, a thought flashed through his mind. He thought of Xiaoen's memories of the Temple of Eternal Night before his death. He frowned and said quietly, Perhaps, Uncle really did know Ku He at least back then. Next, he told Wu Zhu all the stories he had heard in the cave, hoping that he could recall something important. For example, Wu Zhu's relationship with the temple. When he was little, he had heard Wu Zhu say that he and his mother had escaped from home together. Could that home have been the temple? Wu Zhu was silent for a long time. He did not appear in the novel where he clutched his head in meditation and pulled at his hair in pain, but could not remember anything. He simply said, "I can't remember." So it was Fan Xien's turn to pull at his hair. He muttered in a low voice, "What is this?" He shook his head, dispelling the disappointment in his heart. "Why didn't you return to the capital after you were injured? You were already injured. What was the point of going south to find someone? Is Yi Lu Yun in the south?" Wu Zhu shook his head coldly. "There are some problems in the south. After confirming that Ku He knew me, I went south to find the problematic person. Unfortunately, I did not find him." Fan Xian felt a headache coming on. For the past 6 months, he had been in the north and south, and it seemed that his uncle had not rested much. He had played a pantomime with the imperial advisor of Northern Qi, and then he had gone south to find his family. But if Ku He knew Wu Zhu? Yes, Shaoan had said that Ku He's current fortune could not be separated from the trip to the temple all those years ago. At the time, he knew his mother, but at the time, his mother and Wu Zhu were not together. There was a problematic person in the south? Then who was it? Fan Xian's mind spun quickly. He immediately thought of the case he had received in Shangjing. A cold-blooded serial killer had appeared in the south of the kingdom of Qing. Yan Bingyun took this matter very seriously, and was prepared to mobilize the emperor's personal tiger guards to go find him. But since even Uncle Wu Zhu had not found the person, Fan Xian feared that Yan Bingyun would only be disappointed in the future. He took a deep breath and put aside these matters that could not affect him for the time being. He reported to his uncle what he had done in the past 6 months. He even told him about the secret agreement between him and Haitang that no one else knew about. Unexpectedly, Wu Zhu did not respond. Fan Xian had known since he was a child that Wu Zhu would never praise him, but he had done so many things. He had even killed Shaoan and beaten the second prince so miserably. Surely Wu Zhu would respond as if he were listening to a story? As if sensing that Fan Xian was a little unhappy, Wu Zhu thought for a moment and said something to explain. "It's just a small matter." Well, the struggle between him and the second prince, in the eyes of people like Wu Zhu and the emperor, was not much different from a child's quarrel. As for the secret agreement, perhaps the emperor would be interested, but Uncle Wu Zhu would not care. Fan Xian understood this and could not help but laugh at himself. He stretched out his right hand and said, "My hand has been shaking a lot lately. You have to take a look at it." Knowing that the zhenqi in Fan Xian's body was showing signs of going berserk, Wu Zhu was still inhumanly calm. "I've never practiced it before. I don't know what to do." Fan Xian finally lost his mind when it came to matters of life and death. He lowered his voice and roared, "There's not even the slightest safety factor. I was just born, and you made me practice it. What if I died?" "The lady said it was the best," Wu Zhu replied coldly. "And someone has practiced it before." "Of course someone has." Fan Xian bluntly pointed out the loophole in his uncle's words. Wu Zhu did not hide anything. "There's not much of a problem. At most, your zhenqi will completely dissipate and you will become an ordinary person, unless you're stupid enough to give up your so-called zhenqi at the last moment." Fan Xian was angry. "You're a monster. Of course you don't know how important zhenqi is to ordinary warriors. If I lose the tyrannical zhenqi in my body, I won't be able to defeat Haitang Duo. There are so many enemies in the world who could destroy me at any time. So what do I do now?" He raised his slightly trembling right hand and said angrily, "Am I supposed to let it keep shaking like Wumingda? Right now it's just my hand shaking. When the zhenqi in my body thickens, I'm afraid even my butt will shake." Wu Zhu raised his head. The black cloth over his eyes seemed to be coldly laughing at Fan Xian. "If you don't practice it, your zhenqi will naturally not increase." His words woke Fan Xian from his reverie. Fan Xian had long since become accustomed to meditating and practicing martial arts twice a day. He had never thought about stopping. Now he realized that before he found a solution, the first thing he should do was stop practicing the tyrannical zhenqi of the nameless martial formula. Although the zhenqi in his body would naturally develop and grow during battle, it would be slower than feeding it every day. He nodded and sighed. That's all I can do. Let the Big Bang come a little later. Wu Zhu suddenly said, Fei Jie left some medicine for you. Fan Xian was surprised. He hadn't expected Wu Zhu to remember something from his childhood. He nodded and explained. That medicine was a bit tyrannical. I was worried that if I took it, my internal energy would dissipate. Wu Zhu lowered his head, as if remembering something. He suddenly said, It should work, although it can only cure the symptoms. At this moment, Fan Xian did not dare to completely believe his uncle's words. After all, this deadly nameless martial secret had been carelessly thrown to the side of his pillow. He smiled bitterly and said, We'll talk about these things in the future. First, let's talk about you. Uncle, in the future, before you go missing, can you tell me first? Is that necessary? Wu Zhu asked seriously. Yes. Fan Xian nodded. On the way to Northern Qi, I always thought you were with me, and so was the chest. So I was brave enough to bully Haitang Duo. I didn't think you would be there. Doing something like that could kill someone. Wu Zhu hesitated for a moment. Oh, I know. Fan Xian let out a sigh of relief. Ever since he was a child, he was used to Wu Zhu staying close to him. For example, in the carriage, in the grocery store, on the cliff by the sea. After entering the capital, Wu Zhu spent less time by his side. Although he was strong enough to protect himself, he knew that as he progressed in this world, he would face more and more challenges. Having an uncle like Wu Zhu by his side made him feel that the world was a piece of open land, and he felt much safer. I plan to move out. Fan Xian coughed lightly. Living in the backyard is a bit inconvenient. There are too many people, and you can't live with us. Wu Zhu tilted his head. He was confused as to why Fan Xian wanted to move just for him. Wanner hasn't met you, uncle, Fan Xian said seriously. You are the closest person to me. You have to meet my wife. Wu Zhu slowly said, I have. She hasn't met you. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. And you're always floating outside the manor by yourself. I don't even know where you live or what you do. This kind of feeling makes me, a bit uncomfortable. Wu Zhu tilted his head again. He seemed to understand what Fan Xian was trying to say. The corners of his lips twitched, but he still didn't smile. He slowly said, You deal with it. But I don't want anyone other than your wife to know that I'm by your side. Fan Xian nodded happily. Then he thought of something and said awkwardly, Not even Ruoruo? I've always wanted to let her see you. No. Wu Zhu coldly said, That's it. Go do what you need to do. Pretend I never came back. Fan Xian sighed. Hearing the faint sounds of people getting up, he walked out of the study, rubbing his wrists. In the study, Wu Zhu's face, which seemed to be eternally expressionless, finally broke into a smile that only appeared once every 500 years. And this time, the smile seemed to be joking, as if he was making fun of Fan Xian for not knowing something. In the autumn garden, the grass was covered with white frost, and the sun was warm and soft in the sky. Fan Xian was wrapped in a thin quilt, lying on a soft couch in the garden. He was resting, occasionally coughing, but he was much better than he had been the night before. There was a swing in the corner of the garden, and a few brave maids were swinging it. Their light-colored dresses bloomed like flowers on a small board tied to a long rope. Next to the swing, Sisi and Siki, the two maids, watched with great interest. Their faces occasionally showed envy, but they were too proud of their status to step onto the swing and show off their skills. Fan Xian squinted as he watched the girl on the swing. Her dress spread out like a flower, like a parachute from his previous life. The waxy trousers under her dress flickered in and out of view. He couldn't help but think of a movie called Peacock. A hand reached out from the side and fed him a thin black date. The date was very light and it was carefully cut, very much to his taste. He chewed it 2 or 3 times and said in a muffled voice, "Why aren't you taking care of your father? Why are you here?" Wan-er and Ruoro sat on either side of him, taking care of this unconscious patient. Ruoro smiled and said, "I get bored staying in my room all the time. Brother is sick, and yet he's in the mood to come to the garden and watch the maids play on the swing." Wan-er laughed and said, "He's not here to watch the swing. He's here to watch the people on the swing." Fan Xian didn't bother to explain. He laughed and said, "Watching the scenery, you have to bring the people with you." He then shouted, "Cici, don't be a little wife. If you want to swing, go ahead and swing." These words could easily be misunderstood. After he said them, he was stunned. Fortunately, the girls next to him didn't understand. He was the only one smiling awkwardly. He coughed to hide it and suddenly thought of something. He asked Wan-er, who was next to him, "The autumn is getting colder. Look, the chrysanthemums in the garden are all a bit frozen. Last time, the palace said they were going to hold a chrysanthemum viewing party in the suburbs of the capital. Why haven't there been any news yet? When the first snow falls, even if we want to see them, we won't be able to. Are the people in the palace not afraid of disappointing them?" Wan-er rolled her eyes and smiled. "It's a bit later than last year, but the news is that they're going to the floating temple to see the golden chrysanthemums. Those chrysanthemums are very cold resistant, so they shouldn't be afraid." Fan Xian couldn't help but shake his head. He knew that the delay of the chrysanthemum viewing party had something to do with the recent excitement in the capital. Over the past 2 days, the situation in the capital had been settled. Although many people thought that at this time, he had to pretend to be sick in order to keep the second prince in check. But he knew in his heart that the Overwatch Council didn't need him to worry too much. All the plans had been made, and with Yen watching, he had a good grasp of the situation. There shouldn't be any problems. His body was a bit better, but he still pretended to be sick and refused to go to court. He also refused to go to the first bureau or stay in the council. He just hid in the garden of his home and pretended to be a patient in the capital. It was like watching a play, watching the second prince worry. Higher. A bit higher. Fan Xian hid on the soft couch, with his wife and sister serving him. He watched as Cici, full of courage, swung higher and higher on the swing. It was as if she was going to swing out of the garden and fly over the high walls to see the scenery of the capital. He couldn't help but laugh and shout. Chapter 303. The swing swung higher and higher. Suddenly, Cici seemed to see something high up in the air. She stopped pushing the swing and let it slow down. Before the swing had completely come to a stop, she jumped down in a hurry. She didn't even put on her shoes, which had landed on the grass, and ran to Fan Xian's side. The servant girls who were supporting her jumped in fright. Siki was about to make fun of her, but seeing her expression, he wisely kept his mouth shut. Even the 3 masters on the other side felt depressed, wondering if this young lady had gone crazy. Why was she so panicked? Given Fan Manor's power, what guest would they be afraid of in the capital? Unless it was a eunuch leading the imperial army to search the manor. At the manor gate, "It's King Jing's carriage," Cici said, panting as she ran to Fan Xian's couch. She rubbed her heaving chest. Fan Xian was startled, but immediately came to his senses. He jumped up from the couch and shouted, "Retreat!" As he ran to the back of the garden, he didn't forget to turn around and praise Cici. Clever girl. Looking at his nimble movements, he didn't look like a sick person who couldn't go to court. Wan-er and Ruoro, who were by the couch, looked at each other in confusion. They immediately understood, and their expressions changed. They quickly stood up and ordered the servants to make arrangements to leave the manor. They also called for Ting Zijing to hurry and set up the carriage. For a moment, the back garden of Fan Manor, which had been filled with laughter, immediately turned into a field of rations and horses before a great battle. Everyone was in a frenzy. Some tidied up the couch, some left, and some found clothes for their masters. After a while, they finally finished tidying up everything in the shortest amount of time possible. Fan Xian was escorted to the back door of the manor. At this time, Ting Zijing had also personally pulled the carriage to the door. He's still sick, so he has to hide everywhere. Wanner draped a thick windbreaker over Fan Xian's body. "Uncle," she complained, "I told you not to come see." Fan Xian didn't have time to answer her. Like a gorilla, he bravely crawled into the carriage. Lin Wanner laughed mockingly. She turned around and saw that her sister-in-law was also nervous. She held a small incense burner and followed Fan Xian into the carriage. She was surprised. "Ruoro, what are you hiding from?" As Fan Xian's wife, Wanner understood why Fan Xian had to flee the moment Cici saw King Jing's carriage. Recently, the Fan family and the second prince's faction had been fighting. Fan Xian didn't know how many times Li Hongqing had been slandered. Recently, King Jing had been imprisoned in his manor by King Jing. Needless to say, King Jing had come to find Minister Fan to ask what was going on. Secondly, he had come to talk to Fan Xian. As for the third, it was obvious that he had come to put in a good word for the crown prince and help both sides make peace. The emperor's own younger brother had come, and for so many years, the children of the Fan family had respected King Jing as an elder. They got along very well. If the other side came to make peace, what could Fan Xian do? It was impossible for Fan Xian to stop fighting with the second prince right now. Besides, if he said a few more words, the old gardener would be cunning enough to guess that Fan Xian was framing Li Hongqing. Fan Xian was very afraid of the old man's foul mouth. His status and seniority were enough to crush Fan Xian. What could Fan Xian do? So, of course, all he could do was leave. Of the 36 stratagems, escape was the best. Hearing her sister-in-law's question, Fan Ruoro, who had always been calm, smiled awkwardly. "Sister-in-law, it would be very awkward to meet him now." Wanner was stunned. She immediately thought of how they had bullied Li Hongqing for a few days. King Jing's reputation had been tarnished by her husband. It would be inappropriate for Ruoro to meet her future father-in-law now. She suddenly thought of how her husband and sister-in-law had both gone into hiding. What would she do if she stayed in the manor? No matter what, the person who came was her little uncle, and her little uncle's mouth. Wanner shivered. She took her warm robe from Siki's hand, lowered her head, and went into the carriage. The brother and sister in the carriage were shocked. "Why are you in here?" Wanner rolled her eyes. "Uncle is here to punish me. Do you want me to take the blame? I'm not that stupid." The servants of Fan Manor in and out of the carriage knew the old prince's temper very well. Seeing their 3 young masters so frightened, they couldn't help but laugh. Amidst the low laughter, Ting Zijing cracked his horsewhip. The carriage of Fan Manor, with the square and round logo on it, quietly drove out. The faint sounds of a few young people complaining to each other could be heard from inside the carriage. The carriage was very careful not to take the main street. Instead, it took a detour and left the southern part of the city without being seen by the servants of King Jing's family. Seeing the carriage disappear at the end of the street, the servants of Fan Manor at the gate immediately dispersed. Not long after, they heard a voice like a bell ring through the back garden of Fan Manor. "I'll *CK them." King Jing stood in front of a large group of uneasy servants. Hands on his waist, he looked at the empty and desolate back garden. There wasn't even a mouse left. He was angry. "These little bastards know I'm here, and they're hiding like a fart. Am I that scary?" At the front of the crowd, Lady Lu, the mother of Fan Xian and his 2 brothers, heard the prince say *CK them. She couldn't help but look distressed. Lowering her voice, she replied, "Your Highness, I told you earlier that those children went to see a doctor in the western part of the city today." King Jing looked at the swinging swing and spat. "Fan Jian's illness was cured by Fan Xian," he scolded. "Fan Xian's illness was cured by Fan Xian. Why would he need to see a doctor? Two flowers bloom, one branch first." Putting aside the fact that King Jing was still throwing a tantrum at the air in the back garden, the three young people in the carriage had escaped the Fan Manor. They felt relaxed and relaxed. They felt that the air in Jingdo was much fresher in autumn. Their moods were excellent. Ever since Fan Xian returned from northern Qi, a string of things had happened. Not to mention taking his family to the Tsang Mountains for a vacation or to the country estate on the outskirts of the capital to rest, he hadn't even had a good stroll around the capital. All day long, if he wasn't playing tricks, he was playing tricks, and he was sulking with himself in the manor. These days, the situation had been settled, and he had a bit of leisure. But because he had pretended to be sick and didn't go to court, he had to give the emperor enough face. He didn't want to openly wander the streets, so he could only talk to his wife and sister until their mouths were dry. Fortunately, King Jing had come today, and Minister Fan wouldn't be angry at Fan Xian for running away. This gave the three of them a chance to sneak around the capital. Sitting in the carriage, Fan Xian parted the curtains a little. Together with the two girls, they greedily looked at the scenery and people on the street. The stalls selling snacks were constantly yelling, and there were some selling strange things on the corner of the street. It was all peaceful. Warner pouted. "We're out, but it's not convenient to get out. Are we going to just stay in the carriage?" Roro frowned. "It's not convenient for you to show your face in public," she suddenly said, "but you can disguise yourself, right?" Fan Xian laughed and said, "Even if the people in the capital don't recognize me, do you think they can't recognize the two flowers in the capital?" Even though they knew he was lying, Warner and Roro still felt a bit happy. Girls were easy to please. "Let's go eat at Esher Tavern." Warner was a bit bored, so she suggested, "Let's find a quiet room on the third floor. No one will see us there, and we can enjoy the scenery." Coincidentally, the carriage had just passed by Esher Tavern. Fan Xian looked out the window, and suddenly thought of the first time he went shopping after coming to the capital from Danzhou. It was at Esher Tavern with his sister and brother. He couldn't remember what they talked about, but it seemed to have something to do with strength of character. But he did remember giving Guobaoquan a black fist, and buying a pirated copy of Story of the Stone from a friendly middle-aged woman downstairs. The Guo family had already been brought down by him. The Minister of Rights, Guo Yu, had been hanged in prison for the spring examination case, but the case hadn't implicated him, so he didn't know where Guobaoquan had gone. He didn't answer Warner's question. Instead, he said with some regret, "Esher Tavern, why are there no more booksellers downstairs?" Roro looked at him and said quietly, "After my brother opened Danbo bookstore, Fan Xizha went to find some people, so the authorities have been stricter. There are fewer booksellers in the capital now." Fan Xian was a bit surprised, and then he remembered that his brother had once said that he would use both black and white to break the business of those who sold pirated books. Thinking of this, he naturally thought of Fan Xizha, who was now heading north. He said unconsciously, "Xizha should be in Shangjing by the beginning of next month." The carriage suddenly became quiet. Warner and Ruoro looked at each other, and after a while, they said quietly, "It's cold up north. I don't know if he brought enough clothes." Fan Xian lowered his head and smiled. "Don't worry about that, he's 14. He can take care of himself." Although he said this, what he was thinking was a different matter. At least, Fan Xian's dislike of the second prince had increased. He looked at Esher Tavern again and coldly said, "The Chui family's business is to give money to the second prince. I am not going to take care of their business." Warner did not say anything. After all, the second prince had been with her in the palace for almost 10 years, and they had some feelings for each other. Although she had chosen to remain silent and secretly support Fan Xian in the fight between her husband and her cousin, she could not say anything bad. Seeing that the atmosphere was a bit tense, she laughed and said, "If you are not going to support his business, then you should support our own business, otherwise—" She rolled her eyes and teased, "Let's go to Baoyu brothel." Taking his wife and sister to a brothel? Fan Xian was almost scared to death by this suggestion. He coughed and said, "Baoyu brothel is not my business. It belongs to Shi Chanli." Wana rolled her eyes and said, "Everyone knows that is a trick. If you want to open a brothel, then go ahead. I didn't say anything." Ruoro tilted her head to the side and tried not to laugh. Fan Xian raised an eyebrow and smiled. He said, "Why would I open a brothel? You know I am cleaning up my brother's mess." Wana did not want to hear this, and she said, "It is our own business. Didn't you say the food there is the best in the capital? We are not going to find a girl, we are just going to eat. What is there to be afraid of? Besides, it is our own business, and we do not have to worry about people finding out that you are pretending to be sick and wandering around." Fan Xian immediately refused and said, "If you want to eat, I will ask the chef to make it and send it to the manor. You are a girl, and you are sitting in a brothel. It is not appropriate." Wana playfully stuck out her tongue and said, "When the food is ready, it will be cold." Fan Xian did not look happy and said, "Then can I call the chef to come home?" Wana saw him insist, and she couldn't help but sigh. She said, "I really want to go to the Baoyu brothel. I want to see what my brother-in-law's brothel looks like." She blinked her big eyes and said, "To be honest, I am very curious about this kind of place." Ruoro, who had been silent all this time, suddenly opened her mouth and said, "If you want to go, then go." She saw that Fan Xian was about to say something, and so she said, "It is inappropriate for a girl to sit in a brothel, but is it appropriate for a man like you to sit there?" She smiled and rested her chin on her hand. She said, "Besides, I heard from my brother that you let Miss Sang manage the business of the Baoyu brothel. I have not heard her sing in half a year. If I don't go to the Baoyu brothel, where else can I go?" Wana, seeing that her sister-in-law agreed with her, was emboldened. She asked Fan Xian, "You know I like to hear Sangwon sing. I haven't seen her for half a year, and now I know she was taken to the Baoyu brothel by my brother-in-law. Please take us there." Ruoro then said, "If men can go, then why can't we?" Fan Xian was at a loss for words. He looked at his sister and noticed that she seemed to be getting bolder and bolder. Her way of thinking was different from that of other women in this world. Just from their conversation earlier, it was clear that she was more open, more reasonable, and more feminist than Wana. Of course, this was all due to the way he had taught her since she was a child. But he always felt that the extraordinary temperament she was displaying came from somewhere else. He gave a wry smile and said, "Actually, there is no harm in going to take a look. You guys know that I am a person who loves to shock the world. But there has been a lot of unrest in the capital recently, and I don't want the imperial censors to have too much to say." Hearing that he had brought up a serious matter, Wana and Ruoro sensibly kept their mouths shut. Fan Xian turned his head to look out of the carriage, and he was shocked to find that not too far away was the front of the Baoyu brothel. He couldn't help but laugh at Ting Zijing, who was driving the carriage, and say, "You really brought us here? You only know how to please your mistress, and you don't know how to listen to me. Do you still want to be an official in Donghai County? You should know that your family has spoken to me many times already." Ting Zijing laughed and said nothing. It was Wana and Ruoro who covered their mouths and began to laugh. The Fan Manor carriage arrived at the Baoyu brothel. Although they did not know that it was Fan Xian who was sitting in the carriage, the Baoyu brothel's receptionist did not dare to be disrespectful. Even Si Qing'er, who was in her room on the third floor, recovering from the injuries she had sustained in the capital government, limped downstairs to wait on them. When she saw that it was Commissioner Fan, who was rumored to be seriously ill, Si Qing'er couldn't help but be shocked. To be able to see the legendary young procuress, the two noble ladies in the carriage were pleased. But they were disappointed to find that Sangwon was not in the brothel. She was said to have been invited by some manner to sing. Without this excuse, Fan Xian would not have allowed them to go to the Baoyu brothel. But he was a little puzzled. Sangwon was now a free woman, and she had secretly joined the Overwatch Council. She did not need to care about the feelings of the nobles in the capital, so why would she go to someone's manor to sing? What kind of manor would have such an honor? The carriage left the Baoyu brothel, and seeing the two disappointed ladies, Fan Xian smiled and said, "If you are out to have fun, you should be happy. The Baoyu brothel is not the most luxurious place in the capital, and the food the chefs here make is not the best." Before he finished speaking, Warner cut in and said, "Don't try to lie to us. The Baoyu brothel is very famous. If you want to say it is not the best, then you have to say it is in the palace." She giggled and said, "I don't mind going into the palace to see those concubines. I haven't seen them for a few days. But husband, aren't you afraid that His Majesty will be furious when he sees you pretending to be sick in the palace?" Fan Xian smiled and pinched her nose, saying, "Don't curse me. I will take you to a place that is more comfortable than the palace. The food they make here is better than the chefs in the palace." The two ladies were shocked and thought to themselves, "Everything under the sky belongs to the king. How could there be a place more luxurious than the palace?" Even if the salt merchants had the power to do so, they did not have the guts to violate the rules. The carriage drove out of the south gate of the capital, and when it reached the outskirts, the people on the road became sparse. The secret agents of the Qinian unit and the guards of the Fan Manor, who were protecting Fan Xian in secret, could not help but awkwardly reveal themselves. They looked at each other, and then uncomfortably followed the carriage not too far behind. They followed the carriage to a quiet mountain in the outskirts of the capital. The closer they got to the mountain, the narrower the road was. It still maintained the standard of the Qin kingdom, but the forest beside the road was even more beautiful. The scenery was beautiful. The yellow autumn grass was mixed with wildflowers that had not yet withered, and the trees with white bark and green branches were scattered behind the grass. Countless layers of color, as if it had been painted by a painter, naturally spread out in the surrounding forest. It was very beautiful. Lin Warner and Fan Ruoro could not help but sigh. The scenery here was very beautiful, but why had they not heard anyone mention it? He hadn't even been to this place on his previous excursions. Logically speaking, such a good place should have long been seized by the palace or some high-ranking official to build a residence. Why didn't he know who it belonged to? But looking at the width of the mountain road, they could guess that the residence they were about to go to must be the residence of someone extraordinary. But seeing that Fan Xian was still deliberately mystifying them, the two women were a little unhappy, so they shut their mouths and did not speak to him, only admiring the scenery around them. The mountain road gradually came to an end, and the carriage turned into a forest. A very large manor suddenly appeared in front of them. It was like the residence of an immortal, suddenly removed from the clouds of magic, appearing in front of the eyes of mortals. The buildings in the manor were not tall, but they were distributed very well. They were mixed with the short trees and stones in the garden, complementing the principles of nature. Although not ostentatious, the details of the eaves, corners, and doorknobs clearly revealed a noble atmosphere. "How is it compared to the palace?" Fan Xian asked with a smile. Lin Warner closed her mouth in surprise and laughed mockingly. "Each has its merits, but this is not our manor. What are you so proud of?" Fan Xian waved his hand. "The owner of this place said that he would give it to me in the future. But there is something wrong with this place, and I do not want to move here." At this moment, even Ruoro was shocked. "What is wrong with this?" she asked in surprise. "There are too many women," Fan Xian said seriously. "Who knows how many beautiful women are hidden in this manor?" Ignoring the shock of the two women beside him, the carriage stopped under Fan Xian's command. He got out of the carriage under the gazes of the two women. He took out the commissioner's insignia from his waist and abruptly extended it into the grass to the side. Like a magic trick, a person appeared out of the grass. The person was wearing very ordinary clothes, like a woodcutter commonly seen in the mountains. The woodcutter carefully examined the insignia and stared at Fan Xian for a long time. Then, with great embarrassment, he said, "Sir, this is a dead rule. Please forgive me." "I am not blaming you," Fan Xian said with a smile. "My wife and sister are in the carriage." The woodcutter did not dare to respond. He respectfully retreated and found another unremarkable hiding place. The carriage began to move again, following the mountain path toward the manor. The road was incomparably quiet, but at this moment, the two women in the carriage could guess that this road was no less guarded than the palace. It could even be said that there was danger at every step. Even if a small army wanted to attack, they would probably return in defeat. Of course, these two women were exceptionally intelligent. At this moment, they had finally guessed who the owner of this manor was. To be able to enjoy more luxurious things than the palace, to be able to live in such a garden, to be able to have such strict security, other than the owner of the Overwatch Council, who else could it be? Behind the carriage, the two groups of people who were in charge of protecting the carriage also wisely stopped in their track. They helplessly squatted down and began to herd the goats. Since they were already here, there was no need for these people to be bodyguard. The leader of the Qinian unit, Su Wenmao, nodded to the leader of the Fan Manor Guards. The leader of the guards returned the greeting with some embarrassment. "Be content." Su Wenmao smiled to the people on the other side of the road. "For people like us to be so close to the director's courtyard, it is all thanks to the commissioner's good fortune." Of course. The leader of the guards glanced at the beautiful manor in the distance with some envy. Then, they sat on the grass and began to chew on grass. Bored, they looked up at the sky and yawned. In the beautiful manor lived Chen Pingping. In the entire Qin kingdom, other than the emperor, the old cripple with the most power. Unlike other civil and military officials, Chen Pingping's position in the Qin court was too special. He always claimed to be sick and refused to go to court, so he had time to live in the garden outside the city. Basically, his family in the capital did not live there much. Today, Fan Xian, the young man who pretended to be sick, came to see Chen Pingping, the old man who pretended to be sick. After all, he had been here a few times, so he was familiar with the way. He went straight to the gate of the garden. The plaque in the garden had two large words written on it, Chen Garden. It was personally inscribed by the late emperor, and was incomparably valuable. He looked at the two carriages parked outside the gate and couldn't help but frown. He never would have thought that there would be guests in the garden today. With Chen Pingping's cold and lonely temperament, and the Overwatch Council's evil reputation, ordinary officials would never come to drink tea. Who were the guests today? Wanner got out of the carriage behind him. With one glance, she saw the insignia of the first carriage. She smiled and said, "People of the royal family." Fan Xian was slightly surprised. The old man at the gate of the Qin garden had long since flown down the steps to greet them. He knew that the young Master Fan in front of him was different from all the other officials in the world. He was the most valued junior of the director, and was also the director's appointed successor. Naturally, he did not dare to be arrogant. With great politeness, he said in a very quiet voice, "It's Prince He and young Master Qin of the Bureau of Military Affairs." Fan Xian tilted his head and scratched the back of his neck. The great prince and young Master Qin? He knew that young Master Qin was currently in the palace discussing matters. He was already an important official who had entered the center of the court. Most importantly, above young Master Qin was old Qin, the former director of the military affairs and now the head of the Bureau of Military Affairs, old General Qin. This family was very powerful and had deep influence in the Qin military. The great prince had fought in the West for many years, and his relationship with the Qin family was not shallow. Why would these two people come to Chen Pingping's manor? Fan Xian stood at the bottom of the stone steps and was not in a hurry to enter. He wondered if this visit had anything to do with him. Although the relationship between the military and the Overwatch Council had always been very harmonious, this matter was still a bit strange. He smiled. He did not care that the court found out about his outing. He took his wife and sister into the garden. He wanted to see what this great prince had in mind. Passing through the extremely beautiful and luxuriously decorated garden, they finally arrived at the main hall where Chen Pingping received his guests. Without waiting for anyone to announce his arrival, Fan Xian strode in. He had not thought of what to say, but when he saw Sang Wen singing in the corner of the hall, her face full of unease, he couldn't help but laugh and say, "I guessed it. In the entire capital, only your family would dare to force Sang Wen to come and sing." Sang Wen was not at the Baoyue brothel. She was in the Chen garden. Sang Wen was the shopkeeper of the Baoyue brothel, and she was a new member of the Overwatch Council. For Chen Pingping to drag her to sing a song, it was only a matter of saying a few words. The laughter echoed in the hall. Chen Pingping, who was sitting in the main seat, raised his eyes with a not quite there smile. He looked at the three young men and women who had arrived unexpectedly. His usually cold eyes now had a glimmer of warmth. His skinny hands gently stroked the gray wool blanket on his legs, which had not changed for many years. He laughed and scolded. "I thought you thought I had too many women here? Why are you here today? If you want to come, then come. Why did you bring your wife and sister? Are you afraid I will call some women to come and eat you alive?" The two young men sitting in the guest seats were startled. They turned their heads to look in the direction of the hall, and for a moment they froze. It was Sang Wen who stopped singing. With a face full of smiles, she stood up and bowed to Fan Xian and the two girls. A moment later, one of the young men, who was dressed in casual clothing, still exuded the aura of a soldier. He first bowed to Wanner, who was standing behind Fan Xian, and then he warmly greeted Fan Ruoro. With a face full of smiles, he said to Fan Xian, "Young Master Fan, it is an honor to meet you." Fan Xian had seen Qin Heng before, and he knew that his family background was excellent. He was highly appreciated by the emperor, and he was a rising star in the Qin kingdom. His future was limitless. Fan Xian bowed back and said, "Greetings, young Master Qin." Although Qin Heng's rank was higher than Fan Xian's, they both knew each other's power and status. So, there was no need to play games. Qin Heng smiled warmly and said, "Today, I came to visit the director. I did not expect to see you again, Commissioner Fan. My luck is not bad." Fan Xian saw that his smile did not seem to be fake, and he felt comfortable. He said, "I will not lie about being closer in the future. Since I have met you today, of course I will drink a few cups." Qin Heng laughed loudly and said, "Commissioner Fan, you are indeed a wonderful person. Your actions are unexpected. You did not mention that you were sick and did not attend court. Instead, you wanted to drink to your heart's content. I wanted to make fun of you, but I could not open my mouth." Fan Xian looked at Chen Pingping, who was sitting in the main seat. He smiled bitterly and said, "Of course, we are of the younger generation. It depends on whether or not the host is willing to bring good wine to our guests." Chen Pingping opened his mouth and scolded, "You have more money than I do." Qin Heng's expression did not change. He smiled slightly, but his heart was thumping. He was extremely shocked. The officials had always thought that the reason Fan Xian was able to have such glory in the Overwatch Council was mainly because of the Emperor's appreciation and training. But now, seeing Fan Xian talk to Director Chen, who everyone feared, in such a rude manner, and Director Chen's response was so natural, Qin Hing felt a little strange. It seemed that Director Chen and Commissioner Fan's relationship was indeed not ordinary. Although the Emperor's appreciation was important, if he really wanted to control the Overwatch Council, the most important thing was still Chen Pingping's attitude. It was only now that Qin Hing truly realized that this young man in front of him, Fan Xian, would one day truly control the Overwatch Council in his hands. Then the military had to speed up the process of making friends with this person. It was no longer just him saying a few good words for Fan Xian and then using other people's mouths to convey goodwill to the Fan manor. With only a few words, they had already exchanged a lot of useful information. Fan Xian also understood that Chen Pingping was using this opportunity to express his true attitude to the military and strengthen his bargaining chip. The two of them exchanged a few more words before Fan Xian seemed to react. He turned around and prepared to salute the great prince, who was sitting to the side. Logically speaking, his actions were a bit rude, but everyone in the hall knew that he and the great prince had argued the first time they met. And Qin Hing was on good terms with the great prince, so he did not care too much about this matter. As for Chen Pingping, he did not care about some palace etiquette or any of that sort of rubbish. Just when Fan Xian thought the great prince would be angry, he turned his head and almost became angry. He saw his wife sitting obediently next to the great prince, beaming with joy as she said something to the great prince. Although he knew that Wanner had been raised in Ning the Talented's palace since she was a child, which meant that the great prince had watched her grow up, and that the two of them were like biological siblings, seeing this scene, Fan Xian was still very unhappy. Even more unhappy was that even Ruoro was sitting next to the great prince, listening with great interest to what the great prince was saying. Fan Xian perked up his ears and listened for a bit. Only then did he realize that the great prince was talking about the war in the West and the fight for horses with the Hu people. The people of Qing loved martial arts, and the great prince was a hero and idol among the people. Even Wanner and Ruoro could not stand out from the crowd. Fan Xian felt a bit jealous, and his mouth was a bit bitter. He thought to himself, I am a pacifist. Why don't I go fight a few battles and show you girls how powerful I am on horseback? He was unhappy, but there was no reaction on his face. Instead, he laughed and very naturally bowed to the great prince. He said, I am Fan Xian. Greetings, great prince, Prince He. When the great prince saw Fan Xian, he was already a bit depressed. Hearing his tone, he couldn't help but say, I say, Fan Xian, did I offend you somewhere? When you see me, do you feel unhappy if you don't say a few words to me? He turned his head to Lin Wanner and said, Chunner, the husband you married is not very good. Lin Wanner and the great prince were very familiar with each other. Hearing him talk about her husband, she was not going to let it go. She picked up a fruit from the table and stuffed it into his mouth. She said, How can you talk about your brother-in-law like that when you see him? Fan Xian laughed. Brother-in-law sounded better. He went to sit below Ruoro. A servant from the Chun garden had already brought him hot towels and tea. Although he knew that the great prince and Qin Hing had come to see the old cripple for something important, he shamelessly stayed in the hall, not giving them a chance to speak naturally. Lin Wanner knew that outside the capital, the diplomatic mission and the Western Expedition Army were fighting over the road. In the end, this was Fan Xian's fault. But she also knew the reason why Fan Xian did this. Now that he had the second prince as a target, there was no need for Fan Xian to offend the great prince. Furthermore, she did not want to see her husband and the great prince, who was the closest to her, in conflict. So, she unconsciously pulled the two of them to talk, wanting to ease the tension between them. Everyone knew what she was doing. It was just that men were bound to have times when they could not see through it. So the great prince looked at his nose and ignored her. Fan Xian just smiled and talked to Qin Heng. He asked him how the old Qin general was and when he would take the time to visit his manor. Chen Pingping looked like he had fallen asleep. He was half lying in his wheelchair. It was strange. Even in his own luxurious home, he still insisted on sitting in his wheelchair instead of the more comfortable couch. Seeing this, Lin Wanner could not do anything. She could only sigh. Ruoro, on the other hand, began to laugh. The great prince, who was good at fighting, and the great prince, who was a popular official in the court, were fighting like two little boys. It was a very funny scene. In the end, even Qin Heng felt that he could not talk to Fan Xian anymore. The great prince suddenly said coldly, "I heard that Commissioner Fan has been sick in bed recently and cannot go to court. Even the imperial censorate cannot defend you. I did not think that you would be so interested in traveling today." Fan Xian yawned and said, "I will go to court tomorrow." Tomorrow. Qin Heng was shocked. He thought to himself, "Are you not going to play sick anymore? Then tomorrow, there will be a good show to watch in court, but I was dragged to Chun Garden by the great prince." The thing I wanted to talk about was not easy to say in front of Fan Xian. It was not easy for him to say it, but the great prince was straightforward. He faced Chen Pingping and said respectfully, "Uncle, about the second prince, you should say something." He tilted his head to look at Fan Xian and continued, "I do not care about what happens in court, but the rumors in the capital are a bit too ridiculous. Furthermore, the second prince has a few officials who are truly talented. If they are removed like this, for the court it will be a loss." Qin Heng thought to himself that Fan Xian was quite the scoundrel. He wanted to refute Fan Xian right in front of him. But now that things had come to this, he could only force himself to smile bitterly and say, "Yes, Director. The Emperor has not said anything. If you do not show yourself and things continue to get out of hand, it will not look good for the court." Fan Xian smiled. These two were very straightforward. The great prince and Qin Heng's intentions were very clear. The second prince's faction was already being suppressed by the Overwatch Council, and it was not good for him to make an appearance himself. He could only ask his eldest brother to make an appearance, and he also pulled in the Qin family of the Bureau of Military Affairs. For them to go directly to Chun Pingping was a very good plan. They were not trying to poach Fan Xian, they were pulling in the firewood under Fan Xian's pot. If Chun Pingping really wanted Fan Xian to stop, he would have to agree. However, he had already received the benefits he deserved. The Jingdo magistrate had been removed, and the officials sent by the second prince in the 6 ministries had all met with some misfortune. Fan Xian did not care much about these things. Instead, he cared about the way the great prince had addressed him earlier. He had called Chun Pingping uncle. No matter how unfathomable Chun Pingping's power was, no matter how close he was to the emperor, it was still inappropriate for the great prince to call him uncle. If word got out, it would probably scare people to death. Who was Fan Xian's uncle? It was King Jing, not an official. While he was thinking, Chun Pingping had already opened his listless eyes. He coughed and said, "We'll talk about the second prince later. I say." He pointed at Lin Wanner and Roro and coughed. Ahem, this is the first time you two have come to my garden. Why don't you greet the host?" In reality, there were not many people who were not afraid of Chun Pingping. Especially in many legends and stories, Chun Pingping had been successfully made into the image of a demon who could not walk. Although Lin Wanner and Roro were of noble status, facing the leader of the dark forces of the Qin kingdom, they still felt some fear. So when they entered the hall, they quickly sat next to the great prince. Hearing the old man speak, Lin Wanner and Roro had no choice but to stand up with bitter faces. They walked in front of Chun Pingping and bowed, giving him the courtesy of a junior. Chun Pingping laughed and said, "What are you afraid of? You have a mother and a father, you are not much better than me." He was talking about the eldest princess and the crafty minister Fan. He then said to the great prince, "As for the matter you spoke of, since the person in question is already here, you can tell him directly. He can make the decision. Princess, Lady Fan, help me push the old man's wheelchair. I will take you to see the treasures in Chin Garden." The two girls and Sang Wen pushed the old cripple's wheelchair out of the hall, leaving Fan Xian and the great Prince Qin Heng behind. They looked at each other, thinking that the old man did not do things in the right way. He used his own home as a battlefield for the juniors to fight while he took 3 beautiful women to walk around the garden. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.